Okay, let's get started. Welcome to this seminar on basic creating in IMVU. My name is Rick Eros. I've been creating in IMVU since 2018. Started off with a simple t-shirt and grew to a whole line of suits, jeans, some dresses, and even starting to dabble with rooms. This seminar really came about because many of you have asked me on how to create because you've never done it, or some of you have been creating and are asking, how did I get something to look that good, or how did I build this? And I felt it would be a little easier for me to just create a whole seminar and go through, in a sense, my thought process and how I approach creating. Now, everything I show in here isn't, let's say, rule of law, but it might give you inspiration as to how you approach creating an IMVU. Now, we have to remember that there are different skill sets in this room. Some of you have actually been creating, others of you have never touched it at all. Some of you have used full-on professional level graphics editing programs. Others of you have barely touched anything outside of little apps on your phone to make edits. So I'm going to treat everything in here as if none of you have ever created anything in IMVU, and the only graphics kind of experience you have is maybe little apps on your phone like Snapseed. If you obviously have more skills than that, I apologize, but just be patient. Now, before we really get this started, I want everyone to know you're all muted. I muted everyone in the chat because I just don't want to deal with the background noise. It happens. We've all been there. Let's just keep it simple. I will unmute everybody when we get to question slides, but obviously you're free to type questions into the chat at any time. And if that's the only way you want to do questions, that's perfectly fine as well. I'll read them off. Also, there is no need to get hands-on with this. I'm not expecting you to open a graphics program and follow along. I have packages of all the files that you're going to see here today. Everything's set up in the programs we're going to be talking about, as well as JPEGs or PNGs of the pieces, and a PDF of this presentation, all set up on imvutools.com. Also, this is all being recorded. It's going to be posted on Solinari's YouTube, and I will embed it on there. So you can go back, you can watch it over and over again, and of course, you know where to find me if there's questions. For those of you who have encountered this on YouTube, just leave your questions in the comments, and I will check in on them to answer anything that comes up. Now, to get started in creating an IMVU, you're going to need 5 things. First, you're going to need either the classic IMVU client or the new IMVU Studio, both of which are only available on PCs and Macs. Unfortunately, if you are a mobile user, you just can't create in IMVU. That's not my rules, that's theirs. Now, some of you are frowning at the idea of IMVU Studio and the new Next software that's coming out, but it is what it is. This is what's going to become the future for IMVU, and I want to make sure we cover that. Plus, later in this seminar, I'm going to show you a couple of things that might make you consider using IMVU Studio. I know myself, I've been using the classic client for a long time, but even I am starting to dabble with Studio and try to get myself using it. Beyond the software, you're also going to need a VIP membership. Now, this doesn't always mean you have to maintain one because it depends on what your intentions are. If your intentions are to open a shop, sell stuff, and make revenue, then you're going to need constant VIP, which means you should pay for the year. However, some of you have expressed that you just want to make a few items here and there for yourself or maybe for a friend. At that point, you only need VIP maybe for a month, since that's the minimum you can buy. One thing I will make clear is when you put something in the IMVU shop, it's there forever, even if your account is deleted. The only way something really gets removed is basically if you violate the terms and conditions. So if you put something in the shop, it violates their terms and conditions, IMVU will remove it. However, you put something in the shop, your VIP expires, it's still out there, it's just not going to be easily found. Having VIP makes sure that your shop and your products will show up in the shop. But if you take VIP out, then the only way someone can find your product is through a direct URL. Beyond VIP, you are also going to need to be enrolled in the IMVU Creator Program. There's no cost to it. It's just that website you see there on the laptop. Basically, you sign up. I believe IMVU just hits you with all their terms and conditions, makes you agree to them, and then they flip a switch that lets you get access to creating. You're also going to need credits because it costs credits to put things into the shop, even if you're just doing it for yourself. I'll get into the actual costs later, but bear in mind that this is not a free thing. Lastly, you're going to need a professional level graphics photo editing program. For the sake of this seminar, I'm going to be showing 4 examples: Photoshop, GIMP, Krita, and Pixlr. I know there's other alternatives out there like Affinity Photo, but most of what I'm going to focus on today is GIMP, Krita, and Pixlr because they are free options. I know I pay for Photoshop every month, but I use it for professional purposes. The rest of you, I imagine, would rather have a free solution, and thus we have GIMP, Krita, and Pixlr. They're all pretty robust and very comparable to Photoshop, just missing a few bells and whistles. I'll also throw in there in making this seminar that all 3 of those programs will open Photoshop files. It might not render everything in the Photoshop file, but it will open them. That's good to know. Now, some of you out there have probably been making edits using apps like Snapseed. I always keep bringing that up as an example, only because I think it's a pretty good app. And you might wonder, well, can I make textures with that? And the answer is yes, you can. However, I will say 2 things. Number 1, it's going to be a pain in the butt trying to bring things out of your phone or mobile device into your computer and back and forth. But another big reason that I wouldn't recommend apps like Snapseed, you need layers. All the programs that I have listed there have the function called layers, which basically means you get to stack elements on top of each other, blend them in together, and make it work as one. So for instance, the t-shirt that I'm wearing there's a color layer of the black, there's another layer of just this graphic, the underground graphic, and then finally another layer of what I call the folds or the shadows that shows up on top. You might not see it here, but you'll see it in other places. Having an app that doesn't have layers can become problematic, only in the sense that if you're editing this shirt, everything you do is almost permanent, unless you want to keep undoing it. So you could be 3/4 of the way into it, and all of a sudden your flattened image is ruined because you made a mistake. With layers, though, you can actually build even templates. So let's say you build this t-shirt, you really love it, and you want to make about 100 different other t-shirts. With layers, I can keep changing out this graphic and keep putting out as many shirts as I want. I can change the color anywhere I want and not have it affect the others. It's just highly important. And who knows, you might suddenly find yourself doing your edits using these programs. Now, if you're going to get serious about creating an IMVU, I would suggest to create a solid workspace in IMVU. When generally you start creating an IMVU and you open up their section or you open up the app, they will throw you into their little basic room. Let's go have a look. So this is the room that you would get generally in the creators section on Classic. I know you get something similar on Studio Beta, but we'll stick in the Classic for now. So you could think, well, what's wrong with this room? The problem is shadows. Have a look here at the back. You see how everything here is a bit darker gray? I'll pull my mouse away so you can see it. That will really start messing with you when you're trying to get colors to match, especially since this t-shirt has a front and a back part. And that shadowing there can just start to really mess you up, and you're not sure if your item is done correctly or not. What I highly suggest is investing in what's called a shadowless room, and you can go in the shop and get one for under 1,000 credits. So with this shadowless room now, notice the color is uniform, and it's perfect and it's ideal for your purposes. Now you might think, well, I got all these other rooms, why can't I use them? Well, you can. I would use them for testing. Like you build your creation and then you start bouncing in different rooms to see how it's going to look in the lighting and the shadowing and other effects that could be in that room. But for the main work, I always suggest a shadowless room. One thing I've also done is I actually have this room done twice. I actually have also a black version of this room. Let me kill the chat. Because I like to use it so I can take a look and see how folds on a black item are going to look, dark items, because sometimes all that brilliant white can just mess with your eyes and make things not look correctly to you. So it's good to even have, if you really want to get ambitious, have maybe a black room, a white room. I know there's some rooms where you can change the color backgrounds. You feel free to go for that, but just make sure it's shadowless. Now, another thing I would highly suggest is something along the lines of this funky little thing over here. This is called an opacity tester, and its main purpose is to point out a fatal flaw in the IMVU 3D graphics system. Let me change outfits and I'll show you what I mean. Believe it or not, these jeans got me suspended for 2 weeks. I put them out, made them a GA item because I generally like to sell things in GA, And all of a sudden, about a week later, I got reported. Somebody reported me. IMVU didn't like that, and they suspended my account for 2 weeks, which also meant my shop was down for 2 weeks. Not cool. The reason? Basically, somebody saw those jeans through a window or through a beam of sunlight, as you've seen in the room, and they vanish. Now, this only happens in certain circumstances, and I'll tell you later which ones cause this to happen. But imagine there's no underwear there, and now you see someone naked, which means now your GA item becomes AP. Basically, I got nailed for that. I got suspended. And since then, I bought this opacity tester. And I have it in both rooms, as you can see, because I always test everything before I put anything out. And it's important just because you want to watch yourself. You don't want to get suspended. You don't want your stuff to get in trouble. So definitely invest in the opacity tester. Another thing I always put in this room that I think is ideal is one sitting spot. Just a plain generic sitting spot. And the reason is that you want to be able to see how your products are going to look when you're sitting or in different positions or poses. I know when I make something, I start using poses, I start using the sitting spot. I want to see what's going to happen. Maybe it's that dress that you're going to suddenly notice the underwear a little too much. You're going to see a shirt where suddenly your stomach is coming through because the shirt is vanishing into the body. All sorts of different things. It's just best to have one in the room to test your items on, because you have to think about all the different scenarios that the users are going to be taking your product and throwing them into. So let's open things up here to any questions. I've unmuted everyone. Let's see if there's any questions about the basics of getting started. Nothing? All right then, let's move on. When you start creating an IMVU, you're going to hear two terms thrown around a lot: meshing and deriving. These are two different terms that both are involved in creations, but only one of them we're going to do. So let's go into it first off. Meshing is basically creating the products from scratch. It's where you're taking a 3D modeling program like Blender, which is free, or paid programs like 3ds Studio Max or SketchUp, and building the actual items that go into the shop. It could be avatars, could be the furniture, could be even the clothing items. Now, the downside of this is there's a steep learning curve. Even for all the skills and experience I have in graphics, I am really not even anywhere close to a novice in doing 3D. However, I'll also throw out there, though, that meshers can make more revenue than what are called derivers, because you're creating the original items and then everybody's building items from that. So if you're really looking to make revenue in IMVU, I mean, that's something you might want to consider. Take a couple of tutorials and learn how to do 3D modeling. For our purposes, what I've been doing, what we are going to be doing, is called deriving. Deriving is basically creating new products from existing products. It's really just putting a new skin on an old product. And it's nothing new to many of you. I mean, we've seen it happen in video games. I always like to pull up Quake Arena as a prime example, and how many ways people were just building skins and at times meshing too to build new 3D models to kill each other in the arena. The only software you need is any of those professional level photo editing programs I just mentioned. So getting into deriving, the first thing we need to do, of course, is find a derivable. We need to find the item that we are going to craft into our new product by putting basically a new skin on it. Now, I know there are shops inside the apps. There is a whole setup inside Studio to find stuff, but to be honest, the best place I found to look for derivables of all places is the classic IMVU shop website. Let's go take a look there. Now, the classic shop might look a bit dated in terms of a website design, but it has a lot of features that makes it so much easier to find a good derivable versus looking in any of the shops inside IMVU. The big reason? This nice filter here of show derivable products only. Simply check it, and instantly it filters out and only shows you items that can be derived from. Now, when you're looking for a derivable, you want to think more about the shape and less about the visuals. So like this hoodie, for instance, not necessarily a design I want, but it's a derivable. It might have the shape I want. One thing to do especially is to use this try it button and bring it over into the whichever app you're using. As you can see, those links instantly put the item of clothing on. So you can start taking a look and seeing what is going to look right. And again, look at shape. Don't look at the look. If this is the hoodie you want to do, then that's what you want. Because obviously you're going to put a whole new skin on it. One other thing to always look at is this part, derived from. because many people put derivables up from other derivables, and you end up at times spending more money on it. So when you click this, you start to go down sort of a path to find, in a sense, the lowest common denominator, as I call it, where you find who made the original item. Now, if you keep clicking on it and you see something like this, Baggy Hoodie Sunset from IMVU, that's obviously the original item that IMVU put out that somebody else created from. You don't want to mess with that. You want to go find the item that started from, which oftentimes you can see includes textures you can use and UV maps. I have a good example here. There was this combo t-shirt and tattoo a friend of mine was actually making t-shirts from. Paying this person 483 credits, I believe, or something around there to put something in the shop. No textures, no idea what they're doing, until I pointed out that if they had clicked this link, they would have had this t-shirt, which I'm sure some of you have been using. And again, it comes with textures. So you have everything you need to start building from in an easy fashion. One other thing I would probably tell you to be careful with when you're digging up, trying to find a good derivable from a bad one, is to try to avoid things where you see the all-in-one. I know this looks convenient, and I actually almost used this example in this seminar today until I dropped graphics in, and I saw everything was very blurry. Not necessarily a good thing. I basically attribute to the fact that they're trying to put the back and the front of this shirt and the sleeves in one file. Now, it seems convenient, but if you think about it, you're now stretching maybe 256 pixels across onto the front, another onto the back. Whereas, for instance, this shirt, you're having instead the full 512 going onto that front and back. It's a little bit higher resolution. So if you see these all-in-ones, I mean, they're good maybe if you're just going to do simple colors or some simple striping or anything like that. But if you're going to start putting like, logos or graphics on there, it's going to end up blurry. I would probably tell you best to avoid these type of derivables. Now, I mean, down the road, IMVU is hoping to get higher resolution textures in there. They even said that once everything is up and out, that the textures are going to go up to maybe, 1024 pixels as opposed to the 512 limit they're at now. We'll see how that goes. Another big tip with looking for derivables is to test it. You're in the shop, go into the furniture section, bring down a couch, start sitting on it with whatever it is you're trying on and see how it works. I put this t-shirt here as a prime example of why you need to test. This was actually the very first derivable I was using to make t-shirts. And I loved it. I was so proud of my work until I sat down and saw basically these cracks forming. Obviously, it wasn't the best 3D rendering and modeling done, so I ended up not using it anymore. I threw some graphics. I left it in the shop, but I never used this derivable anymore. Save yourself some trouble and test your stuff in different scenarios. Sit, stand, try your poses, put on sizers that you normally like to put on, because sometimes even then, an item you pick might not work well. I know when I made those half shirts for the bar, Sky had come in and said that she couldn't use her chest sizers anymore with it, so I had to use a different derivable. Definitely always test. Now then, do we have any questions about finding a derivable? I'm unmuting everyone now. I see a question. Okay, I got a question. I tried making a shirt once, and no matter what I did, the final result looked blurry. What did I do wrong? Well, I probably think you might have used like what I looked at as one of those quote-unquote bad derivables. It's like I pointed out in this example, because the texture is an all-in-one, it ends up being a very low resolution, and thus you end up with things that are blurry. And believe me, it is tricky. I've dealt with textures. I'm trying to put someone's logo on it or some other kind of graphic on it, and things end up blurry no matter what. And sometimes you have to scrap it and go look for a better derivable. I mean, I'm sure even down the road when IMVU introduces higher resolution textures, it's probably likely going to be only for new products, which means all those old products either can be edited and added in higher resolution textures, or they're just going to be as they are. Do we have any other questions about finding a derivable? No? All right, let's move on to creating textures. Now, you saw in those previous examples with derivables that a lot of them include basically textures that you can use. And I always find that highly important because that's really my big secret as to how I make my stuff look as good as it is. From day one, I didn't want to have stuff that looks flat and simple. I wanted things that have that more three-dimensional look and look more realistic. So in a lot of these items, you're going to find two possible files. First, of course, there are textures. They provide the folds, the bumps, the shadows, the contours. They give the depth and dimension to your clothing. But be forewarned, they're not always going to be a perfect white graphic like this. I mean, this is goldmine if you find that, but not always going to be that way. I'll show you what you can do about that in a minute. The other thing you might see is these sort of weird grid graphics called UV maps. Now, what a UV map basically is, it's a graphic diagram of how the texture is going to cover the body. If you ever want to see really how the texture works with the actual 3D item, take the UV maps and load them in as textures. You'll see suddenly the whole item looks like this crazy weird grid. And I will admit, I've seen some people actually take the UV maps, throw it on the item, and put that in the shop as a product. A little lame, but hey, whatever works. But they're highly important because it shows how the elements are laid into the texture. Now with this t-shirt, you see it's very simple. I've had other items where you see multiple stuff put all together. Like when I'm working on the suit, there's one texture where it's basically the whole lapel, the parts of the shirt, and even the tie all in one. And that UV map comes in handy to tell me what goes where. I had occasions where people asked me to make certain items and they didn't include textures or UV maps anywhere. And I was basically flying blind. So if you find UV maps and textures, that's a really good derivable. Another good use of the UV map is to develop masks, which we will get into later. Again, because it gives you an idea where things are going to be cut and placed. Now, why should you use the textures? Here's a good example. I take that t-shirt example, I put a simple flat design on there, just the color and a graphic, and you see it here. Yes, there's some 3D to it, but it's still very flat, very simple. And I've seen many in the shop do this, where they just ignore the textures altogether, slap colors on there, and everything looks very flat and very simple. Yet you overlay that texture that's given on there and look at the result. The whole thing is very three-dimensional, it has a lot of life, and it looks more realistic, which then will, of course, turn heads to people in your shop. Now, of course, what happens when you find a texture that isn't ideal? I actually am going to show you a trick that I managed to develop when I was creating the suits on how to take what's basically a light texture and make it into a white texture you can use. We're going to switch over to Photoshop for that. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and I've loaded in that texture I wanted to show you. It's basically the front of a long sleeve shirt. And I love the texture, except the only problem I'm having with it is basically it's this dark blue, which doesn't leave much to the imagination if I wanted to make this, let's say, into a red shirt or a green shirt, or even a white shirt if you wanted to even go there. So the trick I realized when I was making suits on how to make a texture work like this work for you is basically to crank up the brightness all the way a few times and crank the contrast down all the way to try to keep as much detail in there. So first thing we need to do is we need to get rid of the color itself. Now, your program might have a black and white mode, or you can always use the hue saturation, just turn the saturation all the way down. So in Photoshop, we have a black and white mode. It'll create the black and white. If we want to use the hue saturation, we can do that as well and just turn the saturation all the way down. We'll go with that one. Then the next thing you want to do is to turn up the brightness and contrast in every direction. So I crank up the brightness all the way, but at the same time I turn the contrast down so we don't have things get too contrasted, and it keeps that kind of smoothness. Now that looks pretty good, except it's still kind of a dark gray. It's not exactly the white that we're hoping for. So we do it again. Open up brightness contrast. I turn the contrast all the way down. Now in this case I could turn it all the way up, but you can see it gets to be too much. If I kind of go down a bit more, find that happy medium where I want to be happy with, maybe that would work. Now you want to test it? I'll throw in a quick adjustment or color layer. Let's take red. And I use the blending mode to have it show through. I'll get into that when we make a t-shirt. And there you have it. And it can work almost for any color we want. Now here's another example, because it always isn't going to be two passes. Here's this part of a leather jacket I found. I don't need to make it black and white because it looks like it's already black and white. So again, I start messing around with the brightness and contrast. I turn the contrast all the way down, I turn the brightness all the way up, and you can see we got dark gray. So you're going to have to keep doing this process until you're happy with it. All the way down, all the way up. Not bad, we're getting there. I would probably do it a third time. Except this time again, turn the contrast all the way down and then slowly bring up the brightness to whatever point you think is ideal for you. This is about where I would do it. Now, I know this looks a bit gritty. If you're going to make, let's say, a white leather jacket, you're probably going to have to do more photo touching to get this thing to look a little better. Maybe try blurring things, everything except the seams and the details, but maybe the general texture to make it a little more smoother. But for all purposes, this is the way easily to do it. Now, if all of that went by in a big blur, don't worry. I listed everything here, what you need to do in the presentation, which is in the PDF included with the files. I put in the detail here what I did to get this result. It's just a matter of playing, and that's really most of graphic design is playing. I play around with it until I get what I want. Now, before we move any further, since we're getting into the idea of downloading things from the internet and using them to put up products that we might make some kind of revenue, even if it's virtual revenue from, we need to have a little discussion about what is known as the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. You're going to see this logo end up on a lot of pages from a lot of derivables and a lot of products. You might wonder what it means. It basically stands for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It was passed in 1998 and put into law to satisfy what was known as the World Intellectual Property Organization. Around the late 90s, with the advent of digital products, we started to see a lot of concern come up about people taking things digitally, selling them, stealing them, sharing them around the world when somebody actually created said item and wanted to make their money off of it. So really, in general, the DMCA makes it illegal to produce and share copyrighted works anywhere in the US, since this is a US law. It is meant to satisfy the World Intellectual Property Organization, so obviously you go to other countries that are covered by the WIPO and you can still get in trouble. Now, how does this relate to IMVU? It really is just to make sure that creators like us are not using logos, imagery, or other copyrighted materials. They do have systems in place supposedly to check if we steal meshes or textures. Like, one thing I've heard is that you could take, let's say, a pants texture from one derivable, use it in a different derivable, and supposedly you'll get caught. I haven't seen this happen. I think they more checks to make sure if meshes are being stolen, like you stole a mesh of somebody's dress, put it out as your own, and you're selling it as a derivable, obviously you're going to get busted. I tend to notice everything generally tends to be implemented by a complaint or a cease and desist. And one of the most biggest examples of this, of course, is the Gucci label. Last year, Gucci basically somehow found out that people in IMVU were using their logo, creating items in the shop, and they had a big problem with it. Now, I know we see a lot of logos in the shop like Nike and Gucci and Louis Vuitton, etc. I'm not sure how many of them even notice or know that this exists or is happening, but Gucci apparently noticed and they didn't like it. One thing to realize, and I've seen this from working in graphics, is that many companies are very religious about their logos. Not just the sense of using them, but also in the sense of like, how much space do you have around the logo? What colors are you using? I mean, I might be violating Gucci's brand guidelines right now in how I place that logo. Needless to say, once Gucci found out, they filed a cease and desist order on IMVU. And all that IMVU can do was basically go into the shop and start purging. They started removing anything with the Gucci logo on it that they could find. That means people's products they created were gone. And also if it was in someone's inventory, it was gone. So that means that the person that put that item in the shop lost their money on what they spent to put it in the shop. But also all those people that bought those Gucci items lost their money because they spent money on it and they weren't going to get it recovered. And I mean, an even worse case scenario happened where somebody had made a derivable using the Gucci logo and others were taking this derivable and building other items from it. IMVU not only killed the derivable, but they killed every item that was created from it. So, for instance, somebody could have made a Gucci jacket, put it in the shop as a derivable, and everybody else makes other items. Let's say you made a skull jacket. Not only was the Gucci jacket removed, but let's say the skull jacket as well. It was a huge to do on the message forums. People were not happy because they lost things that they put up there and they felt that they didn't violate the guidelines, but it is the rules. So my only advice to you is if you're going to use somebody's image, their logo, something you found, tread carefully. Obviously, something like Gucci or Louis Vuitton or maybe Chanel or something, you might get busted. We haven't heard anything yet from Chanel or Louis Vuitton, but you never know. It's always a matter of it could happen one day. I tend to like to build my own brands, partly for the sake that it makes the items look a little more better, a little more polished, but also it just avoids the trouble. So all these logos you see here, these are things I've basically put on there. You've seen the Eros line, Vixen and Lotus on the jeans. Halo is another brand of jeans. Allure is the intimates, the lingerie, and the underwear. And really, it just protects me from ever having to be in trouble with anyone for their logo. Now, while we're on the subject of basically, in a sense, being an ethical creator, there's a couple of other things I want to throw out there. Don't blatantly steal textures, meshes, or ideas. Like, if you're taking a texture, derivable, or something, you want to use another, try to alter enough to make it original. I mean, I'll admit the jeans texture I use for all my jeans started off from one place, and it's still being used in mainly at Derivable, but I altered it to the point that it really is not anywhere close to anymore to what the original was. And, that's a helpful protection. Anything else you take like that, and you're going to see a lot of items that tend to use, in a sense, similar three-dimensional modeling. Obviously, you can switch and change things as you see them, but I always tell you, tread carefully. I don't think someone's going to come down on somebody for a texture as much as they are about a mesh, but always tread carefully. Especially tread carefully with other things like if you're going to make voice boxes, and we'll get into that later, especially the ones for DJing or using full music. You're obviously violating copyright laws. I generally don't do this stuff, but obviously others do it. Tread carefully because you never know. It's not only the fact they could rip the item from the shop, but they could end up deleting or suspending you. I always tell people to don't bite. Don't take other people's work and pass it as your own. You see something in the shop and you think, oh, that's cool, and you take it and pass it off as your own. That's not good. That's biting. However, if it's more about improving, then I'm not going to say no on that. So you see someone's jacket in the shop, you think, man, that texture is horrible. I could have done that better, or I would have done this and this. I say go for it at that point because you're really building a different item. Just don't steal somebody's original thought or idea and pass it as your own because that just makes you a biter. And finally, this is a personal with me. Don't make a new derivable from an old one where you don't change it in any way. I see this so many times, which is why I told you guys to keep hitting that derive from link. You'll see something like, let's say you want to make a white suit and you find a white suit, and then you find out that somebody derived from another white suit where really all they did was just hit the derive button, put it into the shop without changing it one bit, added a little bit of markup onto it, and they're having it out there. To me, it's not only biting on the deriver, the person who made the original item, but it's also, in a sense, ripping you off because now you're paying that person a tiny little fee and that person's getting a piece of every time you sell your item. Always try to get down to the lowest common denominator items so that you basically are paying the least and there's less middlemen. But also, if you get ideas about, doing this, don't. It's stupid. You're just filling the shop with a lot of useless stuff and stealing from other people. Okay, I'm going to open things up again about textures. Do we have any questions? I see a question here. Now that you've made your dark texture white, how did you get the color to show through underneath? The simple answer is called blending modes. We're going to get into that actually in the first example. And that's really the secret of how to take that texture and make colors and graphics show through. That's a good question because it's going to lead us right into example 1. Before I move on, are there any other questions? No? Okay, let's move on. So our first example of what we're going to try to do is building a simple t-shirt. One of the most easiest things you can do in IMVU. I've included in all the packs templates, of course, to make this men's t-shirt and this women's t-shirt. So feel free to use them and make as many t-shirts as you want from this point. Now you're going to also see why I talk heavily about layers. Now, I'm showing you here how I set up my layers, and you'll see it in the files, depending on which program you open. I am not telling you you must set up your stuff this way. There is no rule, except it has to work for you. This is just how I do it. Also, you'll notice that there's a number on every single file. You're wondering what that is. That's actually the number of the derivable that I got something from. Again, you don't have to do that. I do it just so I can quickly and easily reference where I got something from, which especially comes in handy if you're ever building, let's say, a template that's going to go into multiple sizes, like I do with the jeans, an RLS, RL, and RLL. They'll have different derivable numbers, so it's better to just number the files and make it easier on yourself. Now, if you're ever looking for that number or trying to find it, there's two places on a product page you can find it. First, of course, is up here in the URL. You can always copy and paste it off the web address. But also, IMVU makes it quick and simple. These big red numbers down here, that's your derivable number. And they really come in handy when you're trying to call up this item now in whatever creator platform you're using, because it's an easy way to find them as opposed to trying to search by, names or other items that could come up. So definitely always take note of those numbers. Now, getting back to our layers, you can see they're set up here in whatever your weapon of choice is. We're going to be using Krita for this example. And basically, as you see, I always put the color on the bottom, then whatever graphics there are on top, and then finally what I call the folds layer, or sometimes it'll be multiple layers combined together, whatever way you want to do it. But that's like the shadows and the folds and the items. And then on top of that, I always have the map. Now, the map doesn't generally end up in the final file. I just leave it in there as my reference point. It's always handy, especially when you're trying to get into more complicated designs. So let's jump over to Krita and take a look. So here we are in Krita, and I basically have opened up here the front of the female t-shirt. Now this logo up here is simply here for educational purposes. I would probably advise any of you thinking that you're going to put this in the shop not to. IMVU is a bit touchy about using their logo in certain things. I think in this case it's fine, but if we were to put this in the shop, you'll probably get into trouble. In any case, I left things black and white so you can obviously see the simplicity of how this all works. If you look at the file itself, I've included a couple of color layers so you can obviously see how things come through. Now the question, of course, comes down to how is it that I get this red to show up and yet all these folds are still here? The answer is what's called blending modes. In any of these programs on the layers, I believe in Pixlr, you got to hit 3 dots to open up a little window to get it, but most of them it's up top here. You'll see this menu of what are called blending modes. Now, the normal mode is basically what you're going to have most items in. This is your normal mode. That's it. It's the way it came in. But you start to play with these modes and you can start having it do different things. Multiply is the one I generally use on white textures to make the folds and everything come out with the color showing through. What multiply really does is it makes anything light transparent and anything dark show through. Now obviously you can try other things. The opposite of that would be what's called screen. As you can see here, it makes dark items transparent and light items show through. That can come in handy, and I'll show you that later possibly on the second example. Now with all of these, you might think, well, which one am I supposed to use? I generally am using multiply or screen, but again, the same rule, play with it. Just start playing until you get the answer you want. You might decide to do something different and come up with a whole new result that's happy with you. Now, for this purposes, we're going to make a black t-shirt for the girl. So I've included here a white logo, but you also notice my black is not a full black. If I take out the folds layer, it might not be easy on your screen to see, but I'm actually not using full-on black. And the reason for that is I want those folds to show through. And if you ever look at any real black clothing, you notice it's never a complete full black, like completely devoid of color. You're always going to see kind of like something very close, because most clothing manufacturers make black by combining a number of colors together until they just get that darkness they want. And you might have seen in the shop too, some like black items are really kind of an incredibly dark gray, but that's because they want things to show through. Now, for my purposes, I use a very close to black. If you had hex colors in front of you, it's just 6 ones, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And that's what I've been using for blacks. Now, in this case also, you notice I duplicated the folds layer twice because I felt like with one of them, you don't really see those folds, but 2 of them, you kind of can see them. Now, some of you might think, well, that's still not coming in enough. At that point, you can always, make the black less black, or turn on the white layer and start playing with the opacity if you want. get whatever you feel that works for you. For me, I like to always just, go on with a simple black because in a light colored room, you don't really want to see the folds too clearly. Whereas in dark colored rooms, you're going to see it come out. Now, for our purposes, we're just going to make a simple black t-shirt with a white logo for the girls and a white t-shirt with a black logo for the guys. So really all you need is just your color layer, your folds. In this case, I'm using it twice to make sure it shows up, and that logo. Now, if you wanted to ask me how the heck do you make this thing from scratch, you would basically start a new document, and in Krita, you're going to go in the layers. I know in Photoshop it's in File, but here it's in Layers. You go to Import, Export. You can import like a paint layer, a transparency mask, filter selection, but we just want to import a layer. And go to what's the folder, as I call it, the original files, because as you can see, I put everything in there, and you can just bring it in. That's it. It's in there. In this case, we don't need to do it because I've set everything else up. But that's really a lot of what I do. I'm just taking these JPEGs I get from a Derivable, bringing them into layers, and then creating my final item. So in this case, as I said, you have to build all the pieces. There's the front of the t-shirt, the back of the women's t-shirt. Then for the men, there's the sleeves, the front, and the back, because that's how they were built. From this point, you're going to take all of these and save them out as JPEGs. So we can do like, in this point, save as. Let's find a folder we're going to put it in. And you're going to, pick from this wide selection of things you can save it out as. We're just going to make JPEGs. You can use PNGs, but JPEGs work just fine. When you save your stuff out, they're going to always ask you about quality. Now, I know in Photoshop, we have a function called Save for Web, which that's what I like to use. And it's very handy because it optimizes the files as best as possible. For a lot of these other programs, they don't necessarily have it. So maybe you want to just leave it at 80%. You don't want to go too low because then you'll start seeing pixelation and artifacting in your file. It won't look very good. And you don't want to go too high because it gets big. Although I will forewarn you, when you're dealing with something that's red, like for instance, if we're going to use the red color and we're going to start saving this out. Let's go save as. I don't know if the preview will show us this. JPEG. Well, it doesn't show it in the preview, but I always notice red, for some odd reason, starts to artifact. That means you start seeing this weird pixelation. So for red items, I generally put it all the way up to 100%, just to be on the safe side. So let's say you save out your file, but you feel like, man, I want to get this small. Now you're wondering, why am I making such a big deal out of file size? You have to think about your item that you're creating in the sense of like when I'm building a web page or when you're building anything. You don't want your shirt or your dress or your jacket or whatever item to be so big in file size that it becomes, a problem, that suddenly it starts to lag the room or lag the person. In fact, that's one of the reasons I always say to use the textures, because then you'll have the exact sizing of the file you need to get. And I've seen people try to put big, gigantic files into IMVU, which then they get somehow compressed down horribly, and somehow the item still ends up big. Let's always think about that this t-shirt you have on, it could also be on with a pair of jeans, shoes, an avatar, sizers, hair, possibly makeup or eyebrows or anything else people put on, jewelry, maybe other extra effects like whether it's a little pet running around or sparkles, or especially people have voice boxes on or other things they bring around. So for all the times we always are telling someone, hey, lower your KBs, part of it comes on us as creators to try to get these file sizes small. Now, if you're using these other programs and wish you could get things as small as possible, I have one little trick I'll show you. This website is called kraken.io, which its web address is kraken.io, like release the Kraken. Basically, this is a service that will optimize images as best as it can without destroying them. Now, the plans and pricing are generally for companies, let's say, that want to be able to run their images through their processors for their own websites. So for instance, let's say Amazon wants to pay them so that all their images run through their algorithms and optimize for their own web display. For some big company like that, it's worth it. For us, we just click try free interface. Down here, you see this area you can click or drag to drop files in there. Let's go and add something in there. Let me go find our file. There it is. So there's that JPEG we just made in red. And obviously right now it's 86.8 kilobits, which isn't that big. It's not really much to worry about. But let's say we drop it into Kraken and show you what happens. It took the 86 and knocked it down to 72, which means it took about 15% off of it. That's not much, but you'd be surprised in some images what it could literally take off. I've had images that went in, 500, 600 kilobits or even megabytes, and it dropped it down to like 100. So it's amazing what this service can do. You can simply download your file from there, and as you can see, there's no artifacting. It looks just as good as when we put it out. So it's a handy little service. That's Kraken.io. Definitely check it out if you need to optimize your stuff any further. So now we've created all our textures. We've saved them all out as JPEGs. Now it's time to actually get them into IMVU. So here we are in the classic IMVU client. I will get into the studio a little later, but this screen is what shows up when you go into your main navigation and click on Create. That is, of course, after you've signed up and are all approved to be a creator. Basically, the one thing we're going to be focusing on is here, deriving new products. Open local project is if you want to save your stuff on the computer itself, which could be handy if you start saving, let's say, templates. So like with this t-shirt example, if you know you're going to be making a lot more, you might want to set up a template. So all you're doing is opening it up, putting in your textures, and then uploading. Edit My Products is more handy if you want to pull up something of yours from the shop. You would find your ID number of that product and stick it in here. Now, this seems a little much having to find IDs and put them in here, and that's why I would probably tell you instead to go on the classic website instead. Whether it's your product or someone's Derivable, they have links on those pages like that Try It link that make it a lot easier. You click and it will open up the software here and have everything set for you. On any Derivable, you'll see a link near the bottom by that big red button, big red number that says derive from this product. Click and it will set everything up in here. If it's one of your products, you'll see a link near the bottom that says edit this product. Click and it opens it up in here. That's a lot easier than dealing with this. But for the sake of the seminar, I'll show you what happens. If you put an ID in here, this is the one of the t-shirt, it'll pull it up. It shows you how much it's going to cost to put it into the shop. And thus at that point you can hit go and it sets things up. This part up here I don't find very intuitive or very handy. It basically goes through a lot of basic items if you want to build something. This sort of the more, bottom, lowest common denominators, I call it. Like, remember that example where we were looking at the derived from and we ended up on a basic hoodie? There's where you could also get that. I don't find it very handy as we're generally going to be using other people's derivables to build from. So if we hit go, it would basically open up this screen. Now I've set it all up already because I wanted to also get my avatar in there. Usually you would see the default kind of IMVU, very cartoonish looking avatar with big hands, head, and feet. I would honestly advise any of you, if you're going to be building a lot of stuff, especially if it's the opposite gender, to invest and build maybe one or more avatars you can use as your models. Because it's a lot easier to build clothing when you can see how others are going to be looking in it as opposed to the cartoonishly looking IMVU avatars. Now up here are your main controls. To apply changes, save. This arrow opens up a link if you want to save as and give this a name other than derived with the ID number. And of course the upload, which will send it to the shop, and I'll show you what happens later. All these tabs here are for basically creating almost anything. Most of them are going to apply towards meshers. The one we want to deal with is the mesh tab, in which down here we have our materials panel. In the materials, you're going to always see things in here that you're wondering, why are those there? And they serve purposes. I wouldn't mess with them. I would only stick with the items that you're actually going to be changing. So for instance, this I believe was from the hoodie or t-shirt or top that they used to create this t-shirt from. I don't know why it's in there. I'm not going to question it. These are the actual two textures that we're going to be changing. This is what I would call an underwear layer. As I mentioned with the opacity tester, this is kind of the thing that would show up if somehow this thing doesn't pass opacity. So maybe if you're going to like cut holes in this using masking, which we'll get into later, you might then want to make sure you have that underwear layer. And this, again, I have no idea why it's in there, but it's in there. It's just a skin composite. Now, in every single one of these material panels, you have basically a whole set of, parameters and things that you can tweak and fix. So right here, this is where your main texture is going to go. So if I hit edit and I go to the desktop, let's go to my example. There it is. I bring this in, it uploads the image in there. So if I were to hit apply, you see apply changes lit up now. If I were to hit it, you can see now it changes. But obviously everything hasn't changed yet because I haven't changed the rest of it. This right here is for basically a mask or an opacity map, which in the next example, I'm going to get you started on that. Down here are other parameters if you need to ever use them. Two-sided is basically the idea if you want this texture to be one-sided or two-sided. And really where that comes into play is if I were to uncheck this and apply changes, you notice you don't see anything change. If I were to somehow, let's say, put an invisible avatar on Lily here, and then somehow look down the shirt, you wouldn't see the front of the shirt. You would see basically out into the room. So the one-sided, two-sided really comes in more handy when you're dealing with rooms. As you've ever noticed, you'll be in the room and you'll see walls, but then you're outside of the room looking in and everything is transparent because they're one-sided. Self-illuminated, I usually leave checked off. When you have it illuminated by the room, that means the shadows of the room will play itself on the piece. But if you go self-illuminated, it will basically be its original color and ignore any illumination in the room. I've had a couple items like you might have had too, where you go into a dark room and you notice suddenly your clothing is as bright and perfect as it was in the shop. That's because it's self-illuminated. However, there are some uses, like I've made neon splat paint clothing and I made them self-illuminated. So when you're in a room, suddenly everything kind of glows in the room. So it has its uses. Fog override is pretty self-explanatory. It basically just overrides if there's any fog in the room. Skin composite is an interesting one. This you use if your texture is like skin tight, but you want to make sure it ends up on top of the skin layer. Generally, we're not dealing with that here, so it's not going to be really needed. Vertex colors, I never know what that means. I should look it up at some point, but I never use it. Use blending and blending mode are basically part of masking, which we'll get into the next example. Now, the texture animation is also something handy if you ever want to use it. Like, you ever seen some of the quote-unquote rave clothing where it seems to be cycling through colors on some part? That's because they're using an animation. The one thing I'll forewarn about animation, though, is that you're basically taking a texture and cutting it into segments to put in here and designating how big each segment is. The downside of that is that you'll lose resolution. So remember I talked about a bad derivable where you're taking about half of a 512 pixel image and showing it as the front, and thus it ends up blurry. Now imagine if you're using 4 parts of an animation and you're putting this in, suddenly you're going to now have basically 128 by 128. So yeah, it'll be blurry. I would say be careful how you use it, but obviously it's there. You notice that most of the animations that ever look good are very simplistic things, like the whole changing color thing. They probably built a rainbow texture and they're just slowly cycling it a few pixels at a time. In this case, we're not using animation. So let's put in the back then. You get basically put in your JPEG, hit apply changes, and there we have our t-shirt. And it's pretty much that simple. This is basic deriving. You simply build your textures, upload them into their slots, hit apply, save it, and upload it. There's not much to it. Now let's go into IMVU Studio and see how it's done there. So here we are in the new IMVU Studio, which is currently still in beta. They've made a lot of significant UI changes to try to make our lives a lot easier, as well as bring it into their current branding. One thing I really love is that every creator has access to their entire catalog right on site. And I think this is great because I can search for items. If I need to edit something, it's just quite simply find it and hit edits. Up top, they also keep track, obviously, of anything that's still being worked on in draft, anything that's been submitted, and of course, anything that's sitting in peer review. Now, in order to start creating an actual product like the t-shirt we're about to do, you can either hit create or we can go hit this plus up here. When you do that, you get basically also, again, an entire catalog of derivables as opposed to those few items that they handed us in Classic. Now it's great because you can start digging through here and see some of it on the avatar here, as well as maximize it to get an idea of how it really looks. The other thing I really love, you click on an item and you get its derivation history. So you can see, like, for instance, this is a great shirt, but oh my goodness, it came out of this shirt. So you could save money and then derive on the lowest common denominator a lot easier. Now, all these hidden items, I wouldn't worry about that. A lot of creators sometimes will start with the empty male clothing from IMVU, build other items and derive from that, and then create finally the item they put publicly. I don't understand it, but hey, it's their world. Now, for our purposes, we have the ID number of that t-shirt we're going to build. So let's put it in. Simply put your ID number in. We got to set the parameter instead of product to product ID and do a search. And there it is. We have it. We see it's the lowest common denominator, and we hit derive, and it sets everything up. Now, one thing to note, the avatar you end up seeing here is whatever you had in your main app, either beta or classic, as how you dressed. I set this up obviously in advanced, but for instance, if you're dressed as a furry, you're going to see your furry self here. But obviously, if this t-shirt interferes with any of that, then those items will be removed. Now, the first thing you might notice is the jeans are bleeding through this t-shirt, and you're questioning, is that a good derivable or not? That really depends. This isn't what I normally use, but it's a good example for this exercise. I always tell everyone, build based on the common denominator. Meaning, if you're somebody that puts a lot of sizers, does a lot of stuff to your avatar, you're not the common denominator. I always try to get bare basic. I take off sizers, I make everything very simple because I want to see how this item is going to look on a regular avatar. Obviously, if it means enough to you that you want to make sure your product works with every other scenario, then definitely go and start building from there. But you should also figure that out before you even start deriving it. That's, again, the picking a good derivable from a bad one. Now, up top here, we have 4 main links. This is to upload meshes, which really doesn't mean much for us because that's for those who are doing the meshing. This is to check for minimum coverage guidelines, and there was something like that also in the classic, but I'm not going to go into that right now. We'll talk about that later. This is if you want to take a high-res snapshot of the whole viewport here, much like what we get when we type in high-res snap or high-res no BG. Oddly enough, they don't have the transparent built into that link, but I have seen you can use the triggers in here. And this last one is a decoration mode. Like if you want to get in here, get into your inventory and decorate the room a certain way so that you can have things set up for your scene. So like for instance, if I want to put in, sorry, I need to uncheck furniture. There's my shadowless rooms. So if I hit that, it puts it in. Now, the only thing I'm not happy with is how in Classic, if I decorated my shadowless room in private, it would have the opacity tester. In here, it doesn't seem to do that. I've made that stink to IMVU and asked them that they try to make things work both ways because it seems pointless if I have to keep setting up my workspace. Over on this side, these are the main tabs of what we're going to be messing with. Material is where our world is going to live. Mesh is obviously for the 3D meshers, and this is more if we're going to build like triggers and actions into there, which we'll get into later when we make a voice box. In this case, you have your material slots with all your different materials. We have the back, we have the front, we have the sleeves, and then this is that tattoo layer where basically you could have tattoos on the arms if you wish. We're not doing that, of course. On this side, the inspector is where we have all our other aspects, much like the classic. Now, the big addition is we now have a normal and shininess added in as well as diffuse and opacity. I don't know why they call it diffuse, but this is where you would put your main template. So if I were to click this, get your little window out here, and they always give you a list of assets. So anything that's in here you can go back to. I hit the plus to upload something. Let's pick the front of the t-shirt. It's in there. And then basically I click it and it adds it in there. Now up top we have our preview, save, and submit, much like we have the apply changes, save it and submit it. If I hit preview, there you go. Now opacity is obviously for masks. Normal is a new thing, which I'm going to talk about later. It's like a means to add more three-dimensional shadowing to your item. And shininess is obviously if you want to add a reflection. Transparency is more like just blending or not, much like we had with the masking. Reflectivity is something I'll show you later with the shininess. Double-sided is two-sided. This is fog override or ignore fog. Self-illuminate, as we talked about. Skin composite, we talked about. Overrideable, we really don't use. Subsurface shading, we're not really using. Same with vertex color. And if we want to have the animation on or not, which does the same exact thing as before. So in this case, what you're going to do is you're going to go to each one of these materials on the left side, and you're going to add in your stuff. So let's get in the sleeves. And then we'll add in the back. Now we don't see it change much because we're using similar textures, so you're not going to see the changes that happen. You can obviously see there's project images, that's your stuff, and inherited images, which is what came with it. But obviously I hit the preview, it puts it in, and there's our t-shirt. Simple, plain, and easy. From that point, you can save it and then submit it. Okay, unmuting everybody. Anyone have any questions about making a t-shirt? I see a question there. How do you know how wide or big you should make something on the t-shirt? That's really experimentation. Even when I made this one, I was experimenting. I put the little quote-unquote logo I created and thought it was too big, started shrinking it down, kept going up and down with it until I finally got something I'm happy with. A lot of what you're going to be doing in creating is going to be, you fix up your textures, you bring it into the either Studio or the Classic client, take a look at it, think about, is this what you want? Then go back, make adjustments, save out new JPEGs, bring them in, and keep going back and forth until you have what what you think is the best item for you. Any other questions? All right, well, we did the simplest thing in the world, like making a t-shirt. And as I said, the files are there in the sample files. Play with it, make lots of t-shirts, do whatever makes you happy. But now we're going to get into something a little more complicated. We are going to make this dress with these nylons. Now, this is a good example of something for us to build for the main reason that it's going to give us an introduction to masking. And you've seen me mention that a few times already. So what exactly is a mask? In the world of graphic design, especially photo retouching and even film, a mask is basically a grayscale image that's overlaid or integrated into an actual image that causes transparency to happen. Anything dark is usually transparent. Anything white is full on 100% opacity like you see it. And the reason I say grayscale as opposed to black and white, because the grayscale end is what basically gives us the idea to blend. It gives us the ability to have opacity, and it gives us a lot of flexibility. I remember when I first started playing with Photoshop, I had no idea what masking was until somebody finally explained to me. I says, how do you make those photos merge into one another? And you can see a simple example here. I took a photo of Lily in the day and then Lisa at night. You apply this mask onto the photo of Lily and put them together, and now you see they're just blended together. And masking has been around longer than even these computer graphic programs. A good prime example of masking is the film industry, especially George Lucas. If any of you have ever encountered a video online of like the making of Star Wars, I'm talking the videos they made back in the 70s, which are worth watching if you want something fascinating. I'm geeking out a little here. They show a lot of the process of how they would film models of all the spaceships and somehow put them all together into the final scene. So in this case, they would do the whole filming of the X-Wing fighter and moving the cameras and model around to make it the movement they wanted. Then they would take that film, now this X-Wing fighter on a blue screen, and run it through several processes, different lighting processes, to basically create a same copy of this film that looks like this or this, where you would see a black silhouette or a white silhouette of the X-Wing on the opposite background. Now, if you're wondering why they're using a blue screen, it's the same reason why if you ever see a weather person broadcasting on TV, they never wear green, and they're always standing in front of a green screen if you ever are in the actual studio. They basically set up their system to mask out anything that is green and put in place their, in a sense, their map and their graphics and other things they want to show. If the weather person was wearing a green suit, for instance, you'd see an invisible person. or much like how Harry Potter looks with his invisibility cloak and only showing the head. Now then, once they had all these masks, videos made, they would also have then the video or whatever they've created of the backdrop. In this case, it's like a cloudy sky. And they would run it through this machine, fascinating machine where you put all these reels of film together and play them all at once, and it films and creates a new reel of film where everything is together. And the machine is told basically that in this case, superimpose this onto the X-Wing, and anything that is white, show it. Anything that's black, don't show it. So then you basically just have the X-Wing showing. And then they do the opposite one on the sky. Anything that's black, have it be a hole, and anything that's white, show it. And that's how they get then the X-Wing to end up on the sky working together. Now you can think, well, why do you need this one on the sky? If they were to not have this mask on the sky, you would then end up seeing the clouds through the X-Wing. And that's really the basis of masking in the film industry, and it's been going that way forever. Even to this day now, although everything now is all CG related, but anybody doing models, they're still doing it this way, even if they're doing it in computers. One last geek moment. If you ever see the making of the Return of the Jedi back in 1983, they had this big box of films that they've made of basically every single TIE Fighter and Millennium Falcon in that one shot where the Millennium Falcon looks like it's flying through a swarm of TIE Fighters. So can you imagine putting 100 pieces of film together with all the masking to make that one shot? So it's amazing where we've gone. Anyway, geek moment over. So how do we use masking in our lives here? I wanted to bring it up mostly because in graphics programs, mostly Photoshop, I know you can do it with Krita, GIMP, and Pixlr to an extent, but it's ideal when you want to cut holes. Now, in my case with Photoshop, I tend to use these color layers so I can keep changing the color any way I want. And then on this little area here is the actual mask. So that's where I'm sort of cutting the holes. You can see these white areas are what I wanted black to show. And then these black areas is where I don't want things to show. That's what creates this final file. Now, when we get into the world of IMVU, you're going to take this mask file and put it with this texture file, because you can see the texture is just a complete blue. And that's what creates, in a sense, the shape of this dress. Because if we didn't have it, you'd see the dress go all the way up to her neck like a turtleneck, and the shoulders pop out a bit more so that it connects to sleeves. And the dress would come down a little further. So really, in IMVU, masking lets us cut and shape items into what we want. And I mean, you'll see it even in the shop. Some items where you think like, okay, that was that big, long dress, and they chopped it down to something with a lot of openings. They're using masking. And I'm going to show you how to do it. Now, for this exercise, we're going to be using GIMP, which is basically a free alternative to Photoshop, available for Windows, Mac, and even Linux, of all places, even though I don't think IMVU is available on Linux. If mine looks a little different from yours, it's because I applied a theme to it called PhotoGIMP. It's free if you ever want to put it in. It makes everything look like Photoshop, but I will say it does not add any new functionality. Now, before we dive into graphics, we need to really look at the Derivable, because this Derivable is a slightly different breed. Basically, it's from a great creator called Sys3D. Sys3D basically doesn't make an exactly like clothing, but makes just derivables. So this is like one of those meshes I mentioned that's probably making some big bank off of all of us creating stuff. And Sys3D tends to build everything, you know, with multiple layers so you can mix and change things up. Like you can see this thing actually has jeans, it has a dress with sleeves and a turtleneck, and even there's a layer on the bottom underneath that's kind of like a bodysuit, which is always a standard of Sys3D's creatables. If you look at the catalog, I mean, there's a ton of stuff in here. The other thing Sys3D and others like Sys3D do is they make everything in multiple amounts of sizes. So what's great about that is, like, for instance, this is RL for the lower end and busty for the upper end. If, let's say, you wanted to make this dress that we're creating in multiple sizes, you can take one set of textures and just keep adding it to the different derivables. This is actually how I make my jeans in so many sizes. I literally have made one texture and I'm just bouncing it into several different derivables made by the same person. But it's important to look at this because if we look at this actually in IMVU itself, you can see there's a myriad of textures here. And it's all sort of plain colors when you get it because obviously Sys3D isn't going to worry about that. On a plus note though, Sys3D does always include 3D maps and even these sort of shadow textures, which I think are handy. Not as ideal and perfect as like full-on clothing, but they do the job. You often though have to like download them, turn them black and white, which I did all of that for you. So in the sample files, you'll find all of this stuff. I did set up sample files like for Krita, Photoshop, GIMP, and Pixlr on every single item in here, even though we're not going to use them all. And that's the next part of the puzzle with all of this. So in this case, you know, we have Amber here wearing the full outfit, and we obviously aren't going to use all of it. One tip I would tell you is to take note of these numbers. When you're dealing with anything that has a large amount of textures, and most of the time you'll get that with furniture and rooms, which we'll talk about later, I would honestly suggest start putting these numbers into your files so you have an idea where they're supposed to go. Because right now, from looking at this, you have no idea where things are going to go, as even the file names, as you can see here, are just numbers. So on that note, let's go first get rid of some of these things we're not going to need, because a lot of the times with these, you're going to have to get rid of things. Now, the way we get rid of these things is basically we're going to mask them out. Here's the thing I generally like to do. So let's go to the 57 and 58, which I believe are these sleeves. I first replace the texture, and if you go into your files that I included, let's see. Sorry. I have this folder called utility files, and in there I basically have things by sizes, 512 by 512, etc., etc. These are usually the standard sizes of templates if you ever need them. But I also have this little 4x4, which is basically small files that are 4 pixels by 4 pixels. I made one in black, one in a medium gray, and one in a white. Now, the reason why I made the gray and the white is really if you ever need them for any purpose. But the black one you're going to use a lot. And even if you don't have these files, it's the ideal. A 4 pixel by 4 pixel texture is basically the smallest graphic you can put into one of these texture slots. So what I end up doing is I put that 4 by 4 in there, and then I put it again on the mask. And then you apply the changes, and you see the sleeve is gone. Now you think this is a lot of trouble, and maybe it will be, but this is unfortunately part of all this world of fixing things in IMVU. Now, you could ask, why use the 4x4? Why don't I just mask out everything else? And the only reason is that it will reduce the file size. I'm not sure how big it is right now, but I do know that you put all these little tiny graphics on here that are one color and they're super tiny. You're basically going to then optimize your creation or something here into something that's of a good tiny file size, so therefore you're not creating the problem in a sense. So give me a minute. I'm going to go mask out everything we're not going to use. Okay, all done. And as you can see, I went and masked out everything that obviously we're not going to be using. And I'll tell you right now, I also did it here in Studio, and it was a bigger pain because of the fact that the numbering changed. Unfortunately with this, I got to tell you, it's going to be a lot of trial and error. Obviously, maybe this is the point you might want to start renaming your textures to match, just so you have an idea. But I would only do that if you're trying to templatize something. Like if you're trying to build something where you're going to be building multiple items of it. So like one dress, probably wouldn't think about it. If you're going to make like a myriad of colors of this dress, then you might want to do it. Okay, now that we got our avatar all set, we figured out what we're going to need based on the dress. In this case, we need this bodysuit that's kind of underneath to build the nylons. We're going to use the dress, of course, to make the short dress, and that's really it. We didn't need the sleeves, we didn't need the jeans or the folds at the bottom. Now it's time to go start building the graphics. So we'll go into GIMP, and let's open up the stuff I've already made. Now this represents the underwear layer. I basically included two different types of coverage. This is the one Sys3D created. It looks like actual underwear. I didn't want to use it, and I instead opted for what the minimum coverage is in IMVU, only for the sake because of the way the dress is designed and the openings I put in there. I didn't want a bra strap or something showing through. The only purpose of this is in any chance anyone's looking in any strange angle, they will not see anything that would make this item an AP item. Now with the nylons, this is the first idea of masking when we're talking about opacity. That's your nylons. That's it. Simple black layer. In this case, I'm using an off black because that's what I like to use for nylons. I don't like using full black only because, again, it doesn't represent reality. But for the mask, there's what we have. And really all I did was I built things in separate parts. Just a couple of simple squares. Now I have the map in here, as I always talk about I do. Like I said before, I like to always bring the map in, stick it at 50%, and then turn the layer off. But then I can turn it on when I need it. You can see that, like, here's the buttocks and here's the legs. So I basically kind of drew that thinner part going across here, and then the nylon going all the way down. Now, since these don't go and cover the feet, obviously they stop at the ankles. Now, we don't save that, of course, when we save our JPEGs. We did it again for the other side because there's a front and back on this. You can see by the map, there's the front. One thing to note when you're thinking about doing things like this and how you make things connect, always let's bear something in mind. See this, how this line comes up here? This line here connects with the same one on the back on the other side. So basically this line here will connect with this here. That's one of the biggest reasons I tell you to use those UV maps. It takes the thinking game out of trying to figure out where it's going to go. Because if you did this on your own, you're going to suddenly find like the front and the back are not evenly aligned and it doesn't look like a whole item. Instead, it looks like two sort of shells being wrapped around the leg. So definitely I always say use those UV items. I'm sorry, UV maps. Now, you're going to ask, how can I make something like this on my own? You'll see masks here. I wouldn't worry about that. That's only because I brought these in from Photoshop and I did them the way I like to do them. Easiest thing to do really is just you set up a new layer. Let's start by that. We want a layer, normal, or fill it with the white. And at that point, I mean, we can knock its opacity down now. I mean, I was using 50%, but in GIMP it looks a little odd. Let's try maybe 36%. And then the next thing you need is you put on that opacity map so you can see where everything has to connect. And let's draw where the bottom nylons are going to be. Let's put them, have them connect right about there. You see how the two connect at the lines? That's the important part. So whatever I do here, I got to do on the back side. And honestly, I mean, you could create one of these nylon textures and use it on both sides the way this Derivable was made. I tend to be over the top thorough and put everything into separate files, but that's just me. I hit the delete button, and now I just have that bottom half. And let's deselect it. And then we have to do it again, because we have to make that thick top part. So add another layer in, have it filled in with white. Sure, why not? Let's make this now about 75% or so. I'm just sliding it somewhere. In this case, now we want to make sure that we don't overpower the bottom half we just did. So I'll bring it down again to, let's say, where I want my top to be. Let's have it connect here. We'll delete that. Let me see where the bottoms connect there. Sorry, I got to check again. Bring it down here, so. Whoops, sorry, that's a mistake. Sorry, I was supposed to then. I should have brought it up from the bottom. No, I make mistakes. It happens. Many a time people have seen me slam my fingers on my desk saying, oh my God. Anyway, let's turn it off. That's easy. That's it. That's building a mask for nylons. Fishnets are a little harder. I'll share with some of you at some point my fishnet texture, but really a fishnet would just be, instead of something half opaque, you would have it at full white and you'd somehow draw the lines in there to be the X's. Obviously at that point, if you don't know how to do it on your own, I would just ask someone for a texture or a mask, or even looking for a Derivable and see what they got. Now with the dress itself, it comes in two parts. There's the texture, and then there's the actual mask that makes the holes open up. For the texture itself, I basically started off with a blue. I wanted some kind of nice, interesting color. I did include black and white in case you want to play around with it. For the folds, I first started off by overlaying folds with multiply. As you can see, where did they put it? Oh, sorry. Right here is where your blending modes are for GIMP. So I used multiply, and I thought it looked dull. I thought, nah, this can't be. I don't like this. So then I had the idea in my head, let's, I started playing around with more of the blending modes. I didn't like what I saw. So then I thought to myself, well, let's take this instead. Let me put it back to normal. And let's invert it. Let's make everything that's black white and everything that's white black. Find it here. Here it is. Invert. So now you have it reversed. Then I tried, all right, let's put it on screen, see what happens. Maybe it'll build a nice shiny look. Sorry, forgive me. I'm used to looking at this in Photoshop. Nice, but I didn't care for it. It just still seemed kind of not eye-catching. So I kept going and going through all these different modes until finally I hit dodge, and there we had it. The blue comes in quite nicely. There's brightness and darkness. It has a beautiful color, and it has that kind of, I guess you could call it shininess look to it. And that's what I mean by just playing around. If you just play around, you come up with what you have. But you also can see you have an entire library of these different blending modes you can play with. There's like burn, which doesn't do anything in this case. Linear light, which sometimes works in other purposes you'll see later. Merging things if you need to, but in this case we're going to stick with dodge because it gives us the effect we want. I did include a layer with the folds inverted so you can see how that kind of works out. Now with the mask itself, there's two masks. There's the front where we have that plunging neckline and then the back. If this looks scary to you, it's not. It just takes time. And again, use the map because as you can see, that's how I made things work. Again, I don't know if drawing masks on layers is the ideal way to do this. I would probably just tell you to just, in GIMP, set up a new layer. This point, let's have it filled with nothing. We'll call it transparency. Because I want an empty layer. I don't want to have to cut things out. Or you could fill it in and cut it out. It depends how you want to handle it. At that point, I would take like a paintbrush. Oh, there we are. You want your brushes, and what you want to do is you see this hardness, you don't want to have it be too down. If you have it down, then what you're basically going to end up with is a soft brush, which is nice for soft textures, which we will use that later for another purpose. But we want something harder. We want it to basically be something that's more solid. So let's stick it about, I mean, you can go at 100% even. And at that point, let me get rid of the layers itself. I would just start experimenting. You go find a line where you want to start, and you can basically start painting, upward. I've learned if you hold down Control and Shift, you'll paint in a straight line. Not in that case, but I'll try again. Like I hold down Control and Shift, you see it builds this line. So if I click this and then I hold down, you can see it builds that line. And you can literally then take that and start building that same kind of texture out of it. Now, one of the reasons I also would say to build things separately in different layers, like don't do all your masks in one layer, is because if you like this, then you could, let's say, duplicate it. Let's see if there's the transform tools where we can flip it around. There it is, transform, flip it vertically, and there you go. You got both sides already done. You can, take the same ideology with trying to build the plunging neckline. I would start from one of these lines up top. So you have that there. Let's get the top and cover this up because we want to cover up the neck. Then again, I mean, you could go down and just draw a line straight if you want. I tend to be very precise like this. That's just me. It doesn't mean you have to do things that way. It's go by whatever you want. And then in this case, because I have a big square now, instead I want something else, you just take the erase tool and you can just start shaving it off. But again, it comes back down to playing. And the only other thing I try to tell you, and I'm not doing it very well here, is to try to keep it even. So I see it ended at this line. I'm going to make sure then that my other mask ends at this line and things kind of end up in the center. But I mean, it could be that simple to build a plunging neckline. Now you think, well, those lines aren't as even as yours, Rick. But I also would throw it out there too that when you put this on the 3D item, unless you have something really oddball, you're not going to notice these subtle things because it's good. The curvature of her own chest and everything else makes up for it. Now, another reason I have things separately is down here. This is the layer of like the shortness of the dress. I've had a few jokingly tell me they thought that dress was a little short. Easily fixed. You simply take your selection. Let's go down 2 notches. And we just delete. Then you just got to make sure the back is the same way. Now for the back, it's the same ideology. I mean, you could have literally actually created this one, for instance. Bring it in, save it out, save it again as your back. Come in, maybe delete this layer. And look, you pretty much got your back all set. Then you just have to build this part. Obviously bring in the map again because you can see it's a little bit different. But again, the lines always will meet. That's the way things work with these 3D objects. If you ever were to come across a derivable where those lines don't meet, then I would be wondering even if it holds together. Because really, these things are generated from the 3D model. And that's the short and simple about building this dress and putting it together in terms of GIMP. I see a question real quick. I'll answer it now. You're wondering why is the underwear layer blue as opposed to black? That's a judgment call. I do that because, again, I want to have it if somebody's looking at it from an odd angle and happens to see even a smidge of this, that it blends in with the dress. Because my whole idea is I want you to see the dress, not what's underneath. All right, let's move back over now into IMVU. This time will be fun and start with Studio instead. So again, you're going to watch how the masks work. So number 9, I believe that's the front of the dress. Let's go get our image. Now in this case, I don't have it marked as 9. I have it marked in the classic ones, but I know what we're looking for here. So I bring that in. Then in the opacity, I bring in the mask. Let's preview. Look at that. Now let's do number 10, the back of the dress. Sorry, gotta wait. There, it all comes together. All right, let's get the rest of it put in here. This is your underwear layer. Let's get that in next, since we might as well. Now, you don't have to keep hitting preview, by the way, in these things. You just put them in. I would just start putting everything in and then worry about it later. Okay, I believe this, let me see which one here. I'm not looking in here for a thrill. That's that pink. I believe number 2 is what we're looking for. I think number 2 is the top of this, which we don't need. That's the bodysuit layer I mentioned, by the way. This and this, but Sys3D makes it into 2 separate items. So we really don't need the top because we're not using it. So let's get rid of it using the utility file. Since we already have it in here, I left it in this folder for my own uses. Cancel, sorry. I forgot it's already in here. There it is. That's one thing I do like about Studio also. It makes all your stuff available to you right there. So I don't have to keep uploading. And the answer, that wasn't it. So let's get rid of that and put in our nylons instead. How about, maybe it was number 3. Let's try that one. There we are. And let's get the last of the nylons in. Yeah, I see the question. No, you don't have to have separate files for things that are exactly similar. I just do it for my own organization purposes. It just comes from years in working in graphics. I just don't like to sit there thinking, where did something go? Now, in this case, it made the nylons instantly. I'm pretty impressed by that. You can see even, I hate to be a perv looking up the dress, but you can see also it cuts off there. Now, the way that happened is because it already had transparency set up. So they have it as alpha test. You can do composite blend, which I believe is what we were going to be doing in the classic. And really, there's no rule. You can use whatever you feel like. Let me find the other one real quick. I'm just going composite blend because that's like the old school IMVU. And there's your dress. That easy. It's really just a case of taking out all the stuff you're not going to use and just using the layers that you're going to use. That's the beauty of some of these derivables from people like Sys3D and all the others that do this kind of stuff. All right, let's quickly go into Classic and do the same thing since I want to make sure you guys have this. So let's get in all our layers. There's our underwear, the bodysuit, nylon part. And believe me, there are some people out there who actually go the trouble of naming their files. But you can see also here, I got to keep going and uploading everything, no matter how many times I had to do it. This is what I had to do when I had to fill all those areas up to block out all those other items. So there is a couple of benefits of Studio that I'm actually liking. Just a couple of things that I wish they'd fix or get better, but you know, we all keep pressing on them and they are thankfully listening. So let's apply the changes, and there's our dress. Now you notice here, this is the thing I wanted to show you. You see how the legs are completely black? It's because I don't have the right masking turned on. So you go here, and you have to use blending, and I have composite like I chose with the other one. Apply changes, voila, nylons. Now, I'm going to show you one other thing that it's nitpicky stuff for me. It doesn't know if it matters to you. I don't know if you can see this if I get close enough. You can see kind of a seam right here. This happens because it's just the way the textures are. It's just the unfortunate reality of life. And I've run into this so many times. There's different things you can do because you can see the shadowing kind of blends in. So maybe we can go in and blend that. But one easy fix whenever I encounter this, because sometimes like even with t-shirts, I'll see the fold kind of come, stop at the seam, and then a new fold here. So it doesn't look very natural. Now, again, you don't really see it here much. So that's really up to you if you want to fix this or not. It's a judgment call. In these dress texture layers, as I mentioned before, I did include this thing, blue number 1 here. And basically what I did, I'll illustrate it here. Let's set up a new layer, make it transparent. First thing I need to do is I need to sample a color. Now in GIMP, you sample a color by opening up your color palette, press this little tool, and let's sample this blue. Then I take a paintbrush. In this case, we need the hardness to be not too hard. We want it to be that kind of gradient look that we saw earlier. And for me, I tend to use the, do the whole click and then hit Control and Shift at the same time so I can draw that nice line. And I don't know if you see it very easily. Let me do it again. This time I'll put it on top of the map because I usually should be using the map. You see how you have that hard edge here? So let's say I were to align up the edge of the brush on that one line. Click once, hold down Shift and Control, draw your line down. Now you notice it's kind of now making it a faded edge on here. We'll do it. I don't think we need to do it to the bottom because there's no seam there. Top, maybe we could. Since there's no neck showing, I'll just click there. And one more time. So what you have in the end really, like I'll get the map off, is you have the same texture, only now the edges have all been sort of like brushed over, and therefore they're not hard. They sort of blend their way into this simple blue. Now, if I do that to the front and the back, it'll really get rid of that seam easily. I mean, if you really want to be also ambitious, you could also like even go down to the folds layer, make it normal again. And let's sample the color there. I don't know, let's use this one. You know, this is something I often do just because of the fact that if I'm going to use something over and over again, I'd rather fix the folds layer than have to constantly fix it. Because what you do when you do this is then you can now make this dress multiple colors. Whoops, let me do that again. I'll just do those two to show, get rid of the map. And, it's not exactly perfect. You have to play with it some more. Maybe I'll bring this in a little further. There, you can see that edge. Now, it looks like I put black on that edge. You can put anything you want. But the idea is that when I turn this, let's turn this back into Dodge, it blends its way in. Now, you obviously have to play with it and get it exactly the way you want it. It's really up to you. But that helps if you're going to then do this thing in other colors. Because then if I decide I want to make it a white dress or a black dress, then your mask is at least all set to go. And that's pretty much the whole gist of creating this dress with nylons. I got one more thing I want to show you, though. One other thing that's important to know with masking before we get into questions. Yes, it's the infamous Vixen jeans again, causing me more problems in my life, but I love them and I'm worth it and I'm proud of it. One thing I noticed is that when I built these jeans in Classic, everything looked perfect, everything went great, put it in the shop. Then one day I was looking at them on my phone because, yes, I like to look at things on the phone and make sure everybody is getting the right experience. And I noticed this strange artifacting happening. It was weird. And I didn't just see it on these jeans. I saw it on a couple of dresses I made and other items like that. And it bewildered me. I was like, what the hell is going on? And finally, I went and opened it in Studio because Studio in many ways recreates the mobile environment. So even if you are going to create inside the Classic, you might want to consider at least downloading and installing Studio to do that quote-unquote mobile check, or put the app on your phone and take a look. Anyway, if you ever run into this problem, the reason why is that I have a mask here to handle the opening with the lace on there. And for anyone who needs to know, the lace happens by putting a white lace pattern on the black mask. So it's like, imagine I drew a triangle here for the opening, and then I overlaid on top of it the white pattern of lace that basically then tells the mask, okay, show this part. On the jeans itself, I just basically drew that same triangle in pink. Anyway, in order to fix this, I realized I had to turn double-sided off. When I turned it off now in all platforms, it looked right. It was just some kind of oddball thing because it's masking on the front and it's masking on the back inside of it, and it caused a problem. So be a little careful about that one. Whenever you see that problem, and always check the kind of stuff when you're using any of that blending, like the composite, the alpha test, or whatever kind of blending you're using, because that's where you're going to see these problems. I notice on straight up masking, you don't see it, like let's say the dress and its openings and stuff, but on the, on anything that's using like composite blending or alpha blending or something like that, or alpha test, you might see these kinds of issues. I'll also add in there to be careful with the blending. It does add a little file size. Some I know love to turn that composite blending on for everything because they think it's going to make it better. I don't fully agree. Granted, it will make your edges a little more smoother if they're coming in a little too rigid, but it also adds a couple of kilobits on there possibly, so be careful with that if you have a big complicated item. And last but not least, if you're using any of the blending modes, that's the moment you really want to do that opacity test, because that's when I notice that clothing vanishes. So if I put these jeans in that opacity tester, they're gone. Whereas like with that dress, you would see the nylons vanish, but not the dress, because the nylons are the only thing that has the composites. Okay, that's a lot, but we can get into it here. Any questions? Let's unmute. Nobody wants to talk today. That's fine. Type it all up. I'll stop unmuting then. Okay, here's a good question. I was in a room where I saw my clothes partially vanish when I sat down. Is that bad masking? No. That again is comes back to where I went back to the beginning and talked about being, picking the correct derivables and why you should test things like sit down, or if you're in the shop, go to the furniture section, grab a chair or a couch that has the normal sitting. I'm not talking about oddball poses, but just normal average sitting, and sit down and see what happens. I've had clothing items where I've sat down and suddenly the shirt or the top vanishes into my stomach and you see my stomach and it looks a little weird. And I mean, sometimes you can't help it. Like, especially when I'm dealing with all those avatars I've bought to sit in different poses, it's a crapshoot. That's kind of why I redid the basic IMVU avatar into that basic avatar remix type of thing, because I love the idea of those poses never seem to mess up the clothing. Personal matter for me. But no, I don't think it's bad masking. If it was bad masking, you would have seen that artifacting if you were on mobile or the beta, or you would have just, seen something not shape right. But if something's vanishing when you sit, that's more a 3D problem, not so much a texture problem. Anybody else? All right, glad you're getting all this down. Let's move on. Okay, we've now done two examples of clothing, which probably represents about 90% of what you're going to be doing in IMVU creation, or at least in the beginning. But there are other things you can create. And right now we're going to dive into the wonderful world of furniture with a simple easy chair. And believe me, this kind of not just represents furniture, but also is going to represent rooms in sort of the challenges you deal with in doing rooms and furniture. Now, the reason why I say challenge is that in the most part, when you're trying to do furniture, a good chunk of the time, you're not going to get any textures. It's just a lot of the, creators that put out product, they're mostly making shapes over anything else. So for instance, that chair you just saw, this is what the Derivable looks like. They were nicely made these textures that number everything, and you'll see a lot of that when you're doing furniture, but they're not going to include actual textures for you to use. I'll confess, even the textures I've given you, I took another chair that was in the shop already, got inspiration from it, and recreated those textures because, I'm not as deeply experienced with it. So sometimes you're not even going to have UV maps, but obviously, some of this furniture is so simplistic that you don't really need to have it. If you're making, let's say, like when I made the CandiBar bar with all those bottles, I'm happy they got the UV maps so I can get the shapes down. But something like this chair, you're obviously not going to need it because it's a lot of very simple squares being scrunched and put into places. One other forewarning, if you dive into furniture and rooms, they will need a lot of textures. That dress I know had a lot of textures in it, but that's because it was built to be a multifaceted creative item. But generally, I've noticed when I've dealt with anything involving a room or a furniture, you get sometimes 2, 3, 4, 10 times the amount of textures you have to create compared to a piece of clothing. And oftentimes, there's not much room to manipulate the shape of a piece of furniture through masking and other tricks. Now, granted, with this one, you maybe can cut some holes in the sides using masking, or mask out the pillows if you don't want them or something like that. But more often than not, like if I tried cutting holes in the back, it might not turn out so wonderfully because you've got different textures covering the back and the front. Now, since these don't include textures, the obvious question is, where can I find textures? Well, the internet. You can start by going online, go on Google, just start looking for patterns and textures. I always suggest searching for things like seamless patterns or something like that, because you want things that you can sort of create a pattern and go from it. So like if you have one of these tiny little patterns, maybe you don't want to have it be that big on, let's say, a side of a chair or a piece of upholstery, but you want to be able to bring it in and multiply it up 10 times or 20 times and make it smaller. And I'm sure all these apps have the means to build patterns in them. So obviously take a look into that and use it. Pinterest is another one to look at. You can sometimes find like textures and other items that you can use for certain purposes. Sometimes you won't need to be able to build patterns out of them. You can just take the texture and use it. There's also online shops that specifically sell textures. If you want to spend money, you can go for that. I generally try to avoid it since this is all supposed to be fun. And one other one I want to show you is sites that are basically showing textures that are used for like architecture and interior design. Now, they're not thinking in terms of IMVU when they made this site, like SketchUp Textures Club. They were more thinking about architects who are, let's say, designing a 3D rendering of a house and they needed textures to make it look realistic rather than 3D. But I ran across this site, I left the address here, and I dig around in there and I find a lot of stuff, and it's free. You got to sign up and be on their system and have a login, but it's free and it's ideal. You could find some good wood textures, stone textures, all sorts of fun stuff you can play with. Now, I'm going to go to Pixlr on this one and show you how I did the furniture because there's a few little tweaks I did based on, on getting the right look and feel, but obviously a lot of this is just very simplistic when you see this. Okay, here we are at Pixlr's website, and I'm showing you this page mainly because there's two different Pixlrs. X is probably what I would tell you if you're just trying to make quick edits or do something for the feed, but what you want is Pixlr E. I know we love to have things easier, but the hard reality is we need to use the E version because then you get all those features like I mentioned with Photoshop, like layers. I have my stuff in here, but I'm going to show you how to get things in there. You can take those files I had and just open image. And we go look for them here. I got them all set. You can see there's a lot of textures involved in this case, 9 of them to make that one chair. Let's open them up. And basically, I set everything up here. How I did this stuff with this and this represent the 2 pillows on the chair. And basically, I simply found a pattern that I actually swiped off of a furniture site of all places. I took one of their photos. It was like a nice straight shot of a pillow they were selling. And I just took that and kind of brought it in here, faded it down a bit, and turned it into what I needed it to be. Now, in this case, as I mentioned, the blending modes for layers in Pixlr, you hit these 3 little buttons and it's right in here. Now, in this case, I don't have a blending mode attached. I just put a transparency on it, 75%. There's no need to get crazy, no need to do all that because I wanted to keep it kind of dull. This is the pattern for the actual upholstery. I had to make a couple of different ones here because we've got what's basically the backrest that's, when you're sitting down. This is the back of the chair, which I made a little darker because it's supposed to represent how, it's kind of shadowy back behind the chair. And then the bottom where you're actually sitting. If you also notice, there's a little bit of color I put in here because I wanted to make it look like that worn-in look. Again, something I got inspired from the guy I was looking at these textures and building it from. How I built this, again, I took a look at some chairs online, saw one that was there. I took it, I cut a piece of the chair's texture out of it because they had a nice angled shot that worked for me and turned it black and white and then stuck it on there. And basically, in this case, the blending mode is multiply at 100%. Let me go back forward here. It's the same deal with these others. I just copied it. A lot of times with these kind of furniture pieces, you don't have to like create specific different items. You could have used this one texture for all of them. Now, this represents the sides. And the only reason I know these sizes is because I looked at what the sample files were at, because they'll give you some dimensions when you open it up in Creator. In this case, I just simply wanted to create, something that isn't flat. So I had a color, I put a little gradient going inside on each one of them. You can take a paintbrush and draw around here if you want. Any way you feel that works to kind of give it some level of dimension. This is the arms, again, based on that. You might not see it very easily. Let me see if I can zoom in. Sorry, fill screen. Okay, this is why I love to use the keyboard more. Again, all I did here was a simple gradient. I didn't add any kind of wood texture or anything else because especially when you got a chair that small, you're not going to notice that kind of graininess. You can go for it, but I don't think you would notice it, so I went with a simple gradient only to give it some level of depth. For the legs, this was inspired based on what I saw there. Now this is odd because they give you a square, but it actually gets scrunched down to a narrow rectangle when I show it to you in Creator. And this, I saw and noticed that on the texture, and I decided to do that. If not, I would have probably just painted some brown on the sides like this and let it be. Now, one thing you're going to notice here is that I actually have the color sitting on top of the texture. Like if you look at the texture, it's a simple gray scale. But the way I got this on here is I put the brown color I wanted on top and used one of those blending modes. This time it was hard light. And again, I didn't know if this would work. I just kept going through and changing things up. At first I had the folds on top of the color and I just didn't like how they look kind of dull or darkened or not right. When I did it like this, it got there. Again, the only rule is it has to look good to you, and that's how I play this game. And finally, for the sort of the bottom, it's that part right in front between the legs. Again, simple gradients. And I'm only showing you all this to really get you to understand that there isn't a whole lot about all of this. I just tend to use a lot of simple gradients and things. Even when people like revel about the bar I made in CandiBar and they say, oh my God, that looks amazing. I think the only heavy detail work I did was on the taps and the bottles. Everything else was just very simple textures and some simple gradients. But once you get into that 3D realm, it will like stand out. So let's take this all into Classic and Studio and see how that all comes together. Okay, there's our wonderfully colorful, very Irish looking chair. As you can see, everything has been more numbered. They have these interesting looking textures, but obviously not very ideal. So let's start dropping everything in. And this is, again, one of those reasons why I number things. Just because of the fact you don't want to have to dig through, especially when you're dealing with maybe a more complex piece of furniture and you have maybe like 25 to 30 textures. So let's get the bottom in, and then the legs, arms. I mean, this looks very easy now, but imagine you're sitting here doing trial and error and you're trying to figure out where was that item I just was using. So believe me, numbering them helps. And if you're wondering where I am, I put an invisible avatar on my own person just so they're not in the picture because we're focusing really on this chair. So you put all your textures in there. Some of them very simple, and there you go. It's not very difficult. Obviously it looks a little dark, but you can see like here why I put that gradient around those sides. And again, this was trial and error. I first put a solid color in here. I didn't like it. So I put the gradient. This on the legs I wouldn't have known until I saw another chair that did that, and I thought that looks actually pretty cool. Let's do that too. You can get so much inspiration from the shop. The gradient, you can see it kind of makes it a dark wood, but it doesn't make it like just some solid blank color. And I mean, you're looking at it in white here, so the details might not come out too well. Let's go to black and see how this looks. You can see those details so much better. See what I mean? Even on the cushions and the items, I always put a little shading on the sides and some shadowing just because it helps. Simple little things like that. I mean, you could set up a layer in your program of choice, paint a little black on each side with a soft brush, and then, set the opacity down to, let's say, 10, 20%, and you'd be surprised how much it adds life to the whole thing. It's not difficult. You just have to be patient and think about it thoroughly. That's really how it goes. So if we look at this in Studio, it's the same deal, except this time we are obviously putting them in different places. Yeah, we could start uploading Amber's dress in there. That'd be interesting, but no, we're not going to do that. Give me a second here. Just get this all put together. I know this seems tedious, but I wanted to show you because then you kind of get an idea of the process of when you're putting your textures in place. you'd be surprised how many people, you know, have no idea what they're doing with that, including me, because apparently in here it's not the same thing. So let's get this straight. Yeah, what I'm getting at is I've just noticed that it's not a 0 through 8 order in here. Like here's number 4. So I have a feeling this thing might not look right once I hit preview, but we'll fix it. I just wasn't paying attention. Whoops. Four, that's number 3. That's number 6. All right, let's see what I screwed up here. That's great. You hit the 3 dots here, you get revert. That's awesome. Saved me a lot of trouble from having to sit here and try to figure out what I did. So this is the 0, 0. Let's find our 0, 0. This is the 01, so let's find my 01. That was correct, actually. I guess I had him correct to the get-go. Preview. And there's our chair. Let's look at it in the dark transparency room, see how it looks in mobile. I am going to make a push on IMVU to let us set up a default space. Now you see how dark it is in here? You can barely make out the detail compared to, let's say, the Classic. I mean, yeah, we can make the stink and say the Classic is better. I believe it has a better 3D engine. I know that IMVU is supposed to be bringing a better 3D engine in. But that's also one thing to be cognizant of. And that's another reason why I tend to look at the Studio at times. Because, you know, it's that same reason why I don't use a full black on clothing. Because then you're inside the mobile and beta world and your black becomes just incredibly black with no detail. So, I mean, I would still put this out there because I'm still banking on the idea that IMVU is going to get their 3D engine in there that's going to improve the colors, because I can't imagine they're going to keep this. But definitely be cognizant of that. And I mean, some of us can think like, why bother? Who cares? But let's be honest. Mobile users spend money, and they are people that put it in our pockets. All right, so that's a look at what happens on the client end. I want to leave some helpful advice when you're doing furniture in rooms. As I've mentioned it now several times, catalog and plan your work when you're undertaking something like this. It's not even just about numbering your files to coincide with whatever platform you're using, but also even just taking time to go through your Derivable and like write down either on a piece of paper, or I'll pop up a text file on Notepad and start jotting down like what items relate to what. Just because you got to then have an idea of what kind of stuff you have to make and, you know, how much work is going to be entailed. Because I'll be brutally honest, this is the infamous CandiBar bar that I keep mentioning that many of you know. This was over 24 textures to make. This room, this forest house room that you've seen me sit in, I have one of these. I actually want to derive it and tweak it and make changes to it and make it my own in so many ways, because there's just things I thought, man, I want to change, like the animal patterns. Plus I want to attempt to make a daytime version. This has over 80 textures. So you have to imagine the amount of work it would be if I wanted to replace everything. I'm not going to, but part of all of this is also me cataloging those 80 textures so I have an idea of what exactly I'm going in to fix and change. Mind the final size of your final textures, because again, if you got something with 80 textures or 24, 25 textures, it could get big. So I'm always, you know, when I was making this bar, I was running all these textures through Kraken before I even brought them into the final result. I didn't do it while I was building. I sort of got everything built to where I wanted it, then ran all the textures through Kraken to compress their file size down as much as I could, put them all in, and then uploaded it to the shop. And also, when I say mind the size of your textures, I mentioned this already before, don't use something that's so huge for two reasons. One, don't bring a giant file in, like let's say 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, thinking IMVU will shrink it down. One, IMVU will shrink it down in a way that doesn't look very nice. But two, you know, sometimes you need to make a pattern from what you're using as opposed to using the one piece. So always be mindful of that. If you really don't feel comfortable making patterns, you can either ask someone who knows how to do it or even just, look on fabric sites, for instance, and you find something now that instead of just the one piece of pattern, you'll see the whole thing and you can just grab a huge piece of it. And last but not least, just add some basic shadowing to give your furniture some depth. That's what I was always mentioning, like about just drawing a little black on the sides of those pillows and the other sides, just to sort of make it kind of gradient the light into the middle. You'd be surprised what it does. I don't know how much you see it here, but even when I did the bar, I was making sort of a very dark gray texture for the panel, and then I'd put shadowing on it. That gives it that three-dimensional depth. All right. Do we have any questions? I guess there isn't any. That's fine. Furniture is a big thing. I would probably tell all of you to start with clothing. And then when you feel the need, you really want to dive into furniture, give it a go. Even there's things that are easy to build versus things that are difficult to build. So start small. Okay, we've learned all about making basic clothing and about masking and even diving a little bit into furniture and rooms and what kind of work that's going to entail. Now we're going to jump into a new concept of the next concept, actually, of building an IMVU by building a voice box. And the reason I chose a voice box is because I want to introduce you all to triggers. Obviously, we've all used them. Many of us know what they are, but for those who don't, a trigger is basically an event or a sound that's tied to a word of text. Sometimes they're also called actions. Basically, it's like you have your poses and you're typing pose 1 and suddenly your avatar moves into that pose 2, etc. Many of you using voice boxes, when you type a certain word, all of a sudden you hear the sound. Or the IMVU DJs out there typing in all their little triggers to trigger not just the sounds, but also their light sets and everything else that they're doing. All of that comes from triggers, and you're going to learn how to make basic triggers here. Now, just so you know, a trigger can be tied not just to an avatar, but it can also be tied to a furniture item or even a room. I know in one of my island homes that there's a trigger in there that will turn on these nature sounds. I didn't know it was in there until I found out. I have this room that's a big city where they put these little triangles on the road. You put a car on there, type a trigger, and all of a sudden the car starts driving through the whole area. It's amazing, all these little hidden gems people put into their products. Last one I'll mention, that little husky puppy I have in many of my rooms. If you type yes, no, or wow, suddenly he does little actions. And it's sad I didn't know that until a couple of months ago, even though I've had that dog since 2018. Anyway, so how is a trigger made, basically? A trigger is it's either made from an animation exported from a 3D modeling file and uploaded in IMVU, otherwise known as an XAF file. If you guys ever decide to derive an avatar or a pose pack or look into it, you're going to see a lot of these XAF files. And those are basically the animations or the poses that things end up in. The downside, though, is that it's not easy to make them. I know that there's some tools out there you possibly can make them from. I haven't messed with them too much. I know they were Flash-based. I even believe that there's one of these same tools now built as a product within IMVU, so you could sit in a room and create your XAF files from it. I'd have to dive in a little more on that. For our purposes, we're going to be doing more sound, which basically in this case would be an OGG file, and I'll get into that a little later as to the why. What I have here really are the sort of a look at the panels that you see to build actions. As you can see, that was that actions tab that you had on the top of the classic or on the studio on the side there. Obviously, things are not always together like that. I only put them together for the illustration. And really, it comes down to a simple idea. You're going to put in some piece of text that triggers your action or something you want to have happen. You can have it tied to a sound here. Um, and of course, you tie it to an XAF file, which is the actual actions. Now, if you're doing a voice box like we're doing, you don't need an XAF file. So let's make a voice box. I mean, what is it? We all know it. Some people are annoyed by them, but for those who don't, a voice box is an invisible accessory you can put on an avatar that contains a selection of sounds linked to triggers. The cool part about voice boxes, which is why we're going to do that today, it's a good introduction to triggers that involves no 3D modeling. We don't have to go and find a way to make XAF files. The unfortunate part of voice boxes is that it's not available yet on IMVU Studio. And the reason I say yet is because we go back here, it has a spot where the sound shows up. They just don't give you any means to upload a sound in. That tells me they're going to get it in there. They just have not integrated sound yet into the new setup. We can criticize them for that, but it at least tells me one day they will have it in there. Now, the voice box we've all known is mostly just something people have on. We think it's sometimes annoying where you're hearing some laughter or some other sound as a trigger comes off. But it's also become integral to what's been called IMVU DJ culture. And this isn't so much DJing like I would do on decks using a program like Tractor or Serato or something like that. This is more the case of people who create a set of voice boxes containing short pieces of a full song. So they take maybe like 10 to 20 seconds of a song and set it up as a trigger, and they put about 12 or so of these into a created item. And usually for a whole song, you could take maybe 2 or 3 of these created items. And then basically in a room, they're playing this song from start to finish by triggering off these sounds and always trying to trigger them at the right point so everything is seamless. And, you know, more skilled ones, I mean, they're bringing in visuals and other stuff or costumes. And I mean, in IMVU, I know it's also called spinning, and I've actually seen events where people go all out, full on suits or changing up the room or doing all sorts of stuff. That's why if you ever encounter one of those DJ rooms, they seem to be incredibly like plain and infinite. There's nothing in there to like get in the way of the visuals. So if we want to create a voice box, the first thing we need, of course, are sounds. Sound effects can be found either online or you can create them themselves. When you're dealing with IMVU, they cannot be any longer than 20 seconds. Now, that's not 20 seconds for the entire created item. We're talking 20 seconds per sound clip. So as I mentioned again with the IMVU DJing, you have parts of a song inside one created item. And if you're putting, let's say, 12 to 15 seconds each little trigger, you probably could get about 11 or 12 items into that voice box. If you're doing little short things like little voice bits and stuff like that, you could get a hell of a lot more, maybe like 20 or more. If you want to make your own, you just need an audio recording setup. Any kind of setup will work as long as you end up with files. You can go all out with, you know, with a microphone and let's say a piece of free software that I put there called Audacity. Or you could just do simple things, like if you have an app on your phone that you can record sounds and then save them out as files somewhere onto Dropbox and bring them in your computer, you're all set there. Lastly, you can also find a lot of sounds online. I put 2 links there, Freesound and Zapsplat, simply as resources. You've got to sign up, of course, because they like people who sign up so they can probably send you emails, but it's free. And in fact, all the sounds I've included today in the examples are all from Freesound. Now, after you make your sounds, you have to prepare them for IMVU. The final files must be in OGG format, which I mentioned before. Now, what is OGG? It is an open source audio format. It's basically open source like sound file format that was supposed to be like, you know, they originally meant it to be the sound format for the internet. Like we were going to have all our sounds on our websites done with OGG. Obviously, it never picked up, and even now in UX, we talk about sound as not being a wonderful thing on a website. Now, the reason why that they're not using MP3 is simply because MP3 is actually not open source. surprisingly enough. Side example, when I was trying to stream audio online in DJing, I noticed all the software only would deal with OGG streaming. And the reason is because if they had to do MP3, like they have to output MP3 sound, they would need then to pay a license to a company called Lame to make an encoder to put in there. Now, some titles, some places would allow it to be put in there, but in the meantime, most people in places don't. So therefore, we're stuck with OGG. And obviously, OGG is small in a file size enough to make it work, as opposed to, let's say, a WAV file that's going to be huge. Fret not, there's plenty of free encoders online. I mean, there's software out there too, free software even that'll make OGG files, but if you don't want to deal with that, I have 2 web addresses here to make OGG files. I will forewarn you though, they do limit how many you can do in a day. So like when I was making all the example files on Convertio, it hit me at one point saying, oh, you hit your limit for today. So be careful with that. When you do this, try to keep your file sizes small. We're not going after high-end stereo sound because, again, you're going to make your created item too big and it's going to become a problem. And then people wearing your item are going to go into rooms and everyone says, can you lower your KBs? For small sound clips like little voice things and the stuff I included to you, go between like 10 and 30 kilobits. If you're cutting up pieces of a song for DJing, go like between 140 and 165. And I'll say it again, just to be on that note, tread carefully if you start cutting up, copyrighted music to make into these DJ clips. I always say tread carefully because you are messing with copyrighted material, and if IMVU decided to, they could pull it down. Worse, they could penalize you for it. Could be a suspension, could be they just completely ban you. Who knows? It depends on how far it goes. However, I haven't seen that happen yet. Maybe because a lot of the stuff being put out is not enough to make anybody blow their head off, or because the sound quality is so crappy that record labels basically aren't going to worry about it. Who knows? But I had to forewarn you. So let's go into Classic since we can't do it with Studio, and we'll set up a Voicebox. Okay, before we dive into the Classic client, I wanted to show you this page and a counterpart, this page, for the only reasoning that it's suggested items if you want to actually start building any kind of voice box. What it basically is Tavinka made these empty derivables to basically, they say put music on, but you can put anything on. It's really an ideal derivable to build a voice box. And the reason I'm showing you the both male and female is that obviously you could probably pick one, build it, and use it on both genders in most cases in Classic. But sometimes you've seen IMVU gets pretty strict about male and female. So my suggestion, if you're making yourself a voice box or you're making one geared at a specific gender, go pick the one that goes with that gender. But definitely I would suggest using these. I know there's other derivables out there that use, let's say, like a ring on your finger and stuff. But I'm not a fan of that. I like anything that's, in this case, that's not going to add anything physical onto the avatar, because really all I want is the sounds. So with that in mind, let's try to derive from the product. And as you can see, it pops it all open, gets it all set up. Let's close that chair. We don't need it. That's what I mean, by the way, by clicking the derivable, it opens it up. See how easy that was? So right now we obviously see our female avatar in here. I wouldn't worry about that. It's not the end of the world. What we're going to look at here is not meshes, because you see there's no meshes, but actions. So we want to start an action. Let's add one. We're not going to deal with this whole bottom part because we're not dealing with any 3D animation. What we want is this button here, Add OGG. So let's click and add something. I got the perfect one I want to add, and the one I've jokingly been talking about. I think I have it in Photoshop. Yes, because I kept all the files on mine. We are going to add the infamous Wilhelm scream. If you don't know it, it's a famous scream from a crappy sci-fi film made long ago. And it's been a running joke in Hollywood for decades that in many action and sci-fi films, you'll hear this scream at some point. So you added your OGG file. You can put a delay on it if you want. I don't bother. Delay might come in handy in some cases. Like I made what's called a silent face palm, where you type face palm and your hand obviously does that. But the original Derivable actually had a sound, and I made mine because I wanted to have one that didn't have a sound. Now, let's say I had a sound of a slap, and I don't want to add seconds onto the, half a second or something onto the file itself to make it time with the avatar, or I'm not sure how long it's going to take. You can use that delay, so therefore when you trigger it, and let's say the hand slaps the head, you can get that slap to hit at the right moments. Just so you know. You can loop things if you want. I wouldn't see why. The ensembles is a different story. That happens to go with the actions. That's more in line with dealing with actual 3D motions. The ensemble really just kind of comes into play on like playing a series of actions to make something happen. We're not going to do that. You can designate if it's a room or avatar. We want this to be avatar. So let's put Wilhelm. I apply this. Now let's try it. Wilhelm. There you go. Now, how do I add more? Hit the add button. Let's put the next one in. Let's try that. Avatar. We leave all this be. Apply changes. You have to apply it in order to make it work. I type in BURP. Interesting enough, that works because I guess they have a burp gesture in IMVU. I didn't add that to mine. That's obviously standard with the avatar. That's just to show your other one is still there. Let's add one more. I mean, I left all the sounds for you. You can play with that thing. Let's try that one, since we're using a female. And yeah, as you can see, you could tie it in with general actions that happen. So if I had a laugh and I want to type it with something, in fact, I'll show that next real quick.
Goodbye.
I got one more. I want to see how this would work, because now you've piqued my interest. Let's say we take the laugh. You can have a little fun with this and might as well use things that are default. Avatar. For those of you who don't know, especially on Classic, that actually triggers an action that's default on the avatar. And that's really how easy it is to make a voice box. I mean, there isn't really much to it. Okay, any questions about voice boxes? Oh, got one coming. All right, I used to have these rings with songs on them, but one day they all stopped working. Was it IMVU killing them? That's a good question. I'm wondering if it was IMVU or the creator themselves. Did the ring like completely vanish from your inventory, or was just the sound removed? Well, if the sound was removed, then it's likely it was the creator who did it. Maybe they got a cease and desist, or it was something else. Usually IMVU doesn't go and like edit a product. IMVU maybe will go to the point of changing a rating if they see something is wrong, but they're not going to go in and edit something. They're more just going to hit the delete button. Wait, another question. Hold on. Yeah, I've seen some triggers out there that literally play an entire song, and that could be done. I'm not sure exactly how they did it. I think if you were to set up a series of OGG files and then use that ensemble thing maybe to have it play in a series, that could happen. Or some people, they just set the file size so horribly, like they make it such a crappy quality that they somehow get it through. But the IMVU DJ culture thing, they'd rather have the pieces because they want to play with that. Any other questions? Okay, we've shown 4 different things you can create. and how to get them all loaded into IMVU ready to send out. So what happens next? Now you got everything set, you saved it. What happens when you hit that submit button? Well, I've laid it all out here. I'll show you both in each client what happens generally. Generally, you need about 7 items that you have to give IMVU before you can submit something fully into the shop, and that doesn't include credits. You basically need to select a category, enter in a product name, choose a rating, set your profit, upload a thumbnail image, enter keywords for search, although that's optional, and set any product controls. Now we're going to go into each one of them. So selecting a category, and I will tell you right now, it can be a mess. Believe me. If you're in Classic and you're dealing with this little drop down up here, you've probably will notice there's a ton of categories in there. And, some of them make no sense. Sometimes you're going in there and you can't seem to find something that really relates to your item. All I can tell you is to, do the best you can. That's the best I can tell you. Half the time, I don't even know what I'm picking. I just pick something that seems to be the best of it. Now, on a plus note, those categories are really only in relation to the old Classic website. So it's not like, somebody's going to be able to go and find straight pants in the online shop or especially the mobile app. They're just going to go by everything else. Now, when it comes to the Studio Beta, that's even worse because their categories are so generalized. So, they don't have, let's say, they don't have, let's say, pants, jeans, slacks, and stuff like that. Everything is just bottoms. And we've already, many of us on the beta testing, have made a stink to IMVU says you got to expand that because there's so many different things. Like I told them, a suit is not the same thing as a sweater, and it's not the same thing as a t-shirt. And, sometimes you're going to find products that aren't even in the right category. Like when I made my first coffee mugs, I was foolish and didn't realize that the Derivable was sitting in a category of hairstyles, which made a big mess because people will look in their inventory, go into their female hairstyles, and see these coffee cups. So I even tried to ask the creator of the Derivable if they could fix it, and even they said they can't fix it because of the way the system is. Thankfully, I found a new Derivable that's an actual accessory, so that helps. But I will forewarn you, when you're picking your Derivable, also look at that category because you don't want to, unless you really don't care, you don't want to end up with something in a weird spot. Now, entering a product name, the challenge with that is that you have a 24 character maximum. So you got to make it work in 24 characters. And believe me, there are times even I'm struggling to get that right. Sometimes I'm trying to put branding in, as you've seen, like with Eros or Vixen or even Allure in some kind of abbreviated fashion. I'm trying to get the size in there. I'm trying to get the color in there and something describing what this item is, all in 24 characters. It's challenging. It gets your brain being creative, but it's the way the system is. I would also tell you, try to avoid special characters and funky text fonts like yatext.com. We've seen people use those weird fonts in their names and stuff like that. The problem is that the title is part of the search parameters. So if you go to like yatext.com and put your product name, let's say, and take some scripty font and throw it in there, first off, I don't even know if IMVU will accept it. Like they might even reject it, you even uploading it. But let's say it even went in there. It's not going to see, let's say, cute t-shirt. It's going to just see a garble of characters, and the search engine's not going to know what to look for, which means you're hurting yourself. So stick to plain text. And as I made a quick mention, consider some small levels of branding because it helps, quote-unquote, fans find your stuff more easily. I've seen it around everywhere like that. I tend to name some of my stuff off brands like I said, Eros, Lotus, Vixen, Allure, Halo, because it can help. Especially if they like one product, they might go look for other products under that same name. Next is choosing a rating, which is the simple GA or AP. It's pretty self-explanatory. I tend to make everything GA unless it's some of the things like the CandiBar merchandise or Allure Intimates because I'm violating usually coverage guidelines, so I make them AP. Some people try to make things AP thinking it's going to add some kind of like interest, kind of like kids who were buying records back in the day with the parents, you know, warnings on it or something like that. I don't think it really does anything. In fact, if more young people who have credits to spend are in and they don't even have AP, they're not even going to see a product. So I would probably tell you just to stick to GA as much as you can. Just make that money. Plus, if you set something as AP and it's not even AP, it still shows up as AP, which means you could be in a room with, let's say, a new friend who's not AP, and they don't see your item, they just see you glowing. So, what actually, in terms of IMVU, are things that make an item AP? Well, I got the list here for you. Excessive and realistic depiction of blood, violence, gore. So if you're making, let's say, some horror costume covered in splats of blood, it's going to be AP. Mature humor. That is honestly open to translation because I've seen, just like you see down the list, strong profanity. I've seen people put profanity on shirts. They get it as GA. No one says anything, and I never see anything come out there. I would say, though, that it's oddly with IMVU, anything of a simple profane nature, they seem to let it go. But anything sexual immediately becomes AP. Nudity, of course, and as I mentioned even before, even if it's on an opacity tester, like if it's a pair of jeans that looks perfectly GA, and then you go in the opacity test and they're butt naked, that's AP, unless you want to add an underwear layer. So that's why I said invest in some means to check your opacity. I mentioned strong profanity, sexual themes, and of course, consumption of tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana. Some of you have seen my avatar with a cigarette in the club. That is an AP item. It will never be a GA item. It's also the reason why, if you ever look at my inventory, and I have all of those, I call them drink accessories, why I name them things like club soda with lime, orange juice with ice, cranberry juice with ice, citrus drink, blue punch. Because it's funny enough, because I named them as non-alcoholic drinks, they can be GA. If I had called them things like mojito, screwdriver, hurricane, vodka with cranberry, then they'd be immediately AP. It's amusing, especially because you could buy one of those accessories and role play it as alcohol. But I guess to the point that everybody's covered because it's now the user making the liability. The next one is to set your profit, and I always tell people to think about it carefully. When you sell an item, here's how the things are cut, and I mentioned we're going to talk about that before, and here we go. You have a derivation fee. That's the money that goes to the person that created the item. And believe me, if you're like that one example where you got a t-shirt that was made a derivable from another derivable, it's not only you giving a cut to that person, it's probably a couple hundred credits, it's then also the 300 or 400 to the person who made the original item. So that's why I tell you go after that lowest common denominator, because you could be paying a lot of middlemen if you're not careful. Thankfully, like I said, with Studio, you can see the derivation tree and decide, yeah, I can go all the way down to the bottom and use that. IMVU puts a 10% markup. I have no idea why they do that. They just do. It seems silly, but that's how they roll. I guess it's maybe like their little tax on the credits of selling things, because these are all things when you're selling it in the shop. And then, of course, there's your profit. Now, I put 35 in there. That's as an example. That's not generally what I would put. I usually go anywhere from 100 to 500 tops, depending on the item. You know, I always tell people to set a price that makes it worth your while, but it won't scare off potential customers, because you want to make something off your work, but you don't want to make it so expensive no one's going to buy it. I tend to think of most of the customers in IMVU as impulse spenders. They're just going around the shop, wish listing tons of stuff, and buying things on impulse to do a shoot or something and then forget about it afterwards. Or a year later, it's like, oh, I forgot I had this in my inventory. I mean, I used to go cheap, but I then realized that these people are willing to spend a little more. So I would tell you anywhere from like 150 to 300 is a good starting point, depending on what it is. But also when you pick that lowest denominator, I keep bringing that up, you can then charge more. So maybe you got that $300 shirt you've derived and you could sell it for 600 and you get 300 credits back. Totally along with the rules, not a problem with that. Then you upload a thumbnail, and that I will tell you to be careful with because they are really strict about this. If it's anything, even 1 pixel more than 100 by 80, they will reject it. If it's more than 50 kilobits, in fact, I've seen it where if it's like 47 or 48 kilobits, they will reject it. I didn't know this, but the file name also cannot be more than 50 characters, but I wouldn't bother doing that anyway. And it can be a JPEG, a PNG, or a GIF file. And animated GIFs are allowed, as you see a lot used in the shop. I'm not going to show you how to do animated GIFs. You could probably go find videos on YouTube for whatever your program of choice is on how to make them. I tend to go very simple with them, just fading through a couple of views of the product so they see the whole picture, but no sense in going crazy on that one. Then there's the keywords for search, and it's funny how many overlook this. In fact, I overlooked it in the beginning until I started realizing it helps. The keywords basically are used in the search. They come up heavily in the search. So you should use simple words that you would hope to bring up those items in a search. I tend to always put the type of the item, like if it's a jeans, dress, bracelet, gown, whatever. I try to put a couple in there for the gender. Like I don't just put men, but I'll put like male, boys, and men, or I'll put female, girls, and women. It seems like a lot, but it does help. Whatever the main colors are. If it's a green item, put green. If it's a black item, put black. If it's a couple of colors, put those colors. Your brand, of course, if you have a brand, if that helps. I'm not talking about your store brand, but let's say the product brand. Like I'll put CandiBar or Eros or Allure, but I won't put, let's say, 606 Creations. Any words of content on your item also help. Like when I made those t-shirts, Monday, you bastards, I put Monday in there just because you never know. Somebody might be searching and there you are. When you put your items, your keywords in, separate them all with commas. Like, this is like old school keywords on a website. It's nothing new. Okay, one last thing and then you can submit. You have to set your product controls. On Classic, it's those 4 checkboxes you have there. On Studio, it's those 4 switches we see there. The visible in shop or searchable basically means that if you turn it on, your stuff appears in your shop, it appears in searches, you turn it off, and it vanishes. I generally will turn off anything that's custom, that I made specifically for people, as opposed to items I'm trying to sell to the general public. Now, one other thing, and I didn't even realize this until I was making this seminar, is display only. I've always known it as you turn it on and it's as it says, display only. The item can't be sold. Even if somebody were to find it somehow by a link or something, they wouldn't be able to buy it. However, I found the one power of that, outside of, let's say, for those in the room who want to make their own stuff and not sell it, is if I make custom items for someone, like motorcycle jackets for a club with names on them, or a bracelet with someone's name on it, or something of that nature. After the client buys it from your shop so they have it, you can then flip it over to display only. So now basically you and that other person are the only ones who have it, and no one else can ever buy it. So it's pretty handy, and definitely use that when you're doing custom work or stuff only for yourself. Allowed derivation from this product, it's pretty self-explanatory. You're asking if you want to allow people to take your product and derive it into new products. To some that might sound tempting, but I'll be brutally honest, I always leave it turned off. I mainly feel like I'm not really creating a new derivable. I'm just creating something from an original. Like, why would I want someone taking from my stuff when I'd rather they go and take from the original? Plus, I also feel like when you put something out there like that, you're now putting your textures out there. So you could make some cool t-shirt and say, oh, I'll flip the derivable on. And then you find out somebody derived, took the exact design without changing it, put it in the shop for maybe 10 credits more, and you find out they're selling because somehow they're getting more traffic. I just leave it turned off. If you're going to do meshing and make derivables, turn it on, but I leave it off. Allow inclusion into third-party bundles. That's simple and easy. The idea that are you going to allow anyone to take your product and put it into a bundle? Like when you make a bundle in the shop, and I'm not going to show you how to do that here. We can always do that another time. You can not just only take your items, you can take any items out there. So like when I made those candy bear bundles where it's the the accessory teddy bear, the furniture teddy bear, I also included a pose pack that's I didn't create. It was from the person who made the actual bear. So therefore it's an all-in-one bundle of everything. So if that person had said, nope, don't allow that pose pack to be in bundles, I wouldn't have been able to do that. So it can be handy. And you've seen even some people where they put together an outfit, and if all the stuff they're wearing is allowed inclusion, they can then say sell outfit, and maybe they'll make a little bit of credits on that, but let's bear in mind you also get credits. So if somebody takes your outfit and sells it as an outfit in a bundle of some sort, maybe they put a markup and they're getting a piece of it, but you still get whatever you put in as your profit. It doesn't matter. So we got all that put in here now. Everything's all entered. We hit submit to shop. The next thing you're going to see happen is you'll see your web browser open and this page appears. Obviously, the HTML design won't be there. I just took a screen grab of one of mine. But the main thing I want you to see is this red bar. It's one final important step after you submit. And it's very important because this is where they say, okay, we got it set up, but we're not publishing it yet. If you click this link, it will then be published and sent to peer review. Sometimes you might want to think about that though. Like I nowadays will leave it in this, quickly throw together my HTML and photo and everything like that, put it in, and then hit the submit button to peer review. The reason why is in the past, peer review would take maybe like a couple hours at the most. Then when the pandemic started and staffing came down and people were doing less peer review, suddenly we would see items in the shop. We'd upload something, it would take 24 or even 48 hours before finally it passed. So I've gotten to the point of being very careful about how many times I put something in peer review, so therefore I don't lose it. So always think about that one. And later I'll talk to you about the HTML end. So let's say you put it all together, you hit that link. You're basically then going to have your item in what's called peer review. IMVU basically has a system in place where we, the creators, go in and judge if something just meets the terms and conditions. We don't judge if it's good or bad. We just judge if it meets all the guidelines. Like if it's a GA product, does it violate any terms and conditions? Is it an AP product? Okay, we can let it be. Or is it a black market item trying to slip in? So what happens is that you'll see on your product page this little orange bar shows up here and it stays there until it passes the review. On the other end, somebody who's doing peer review, and you'll see that in the creation home screen on the Classic. For some odd reason, I don't see it in Studio. I don't know how they're going to do it there. You would get a web page where it would show this product and a button. You click and they would open your product in this little 3D room inside IMVU. I never know what this green rect square is for. Obviously the blue is your standing spot. And this orange, pinkish, beige, whatever you want to call it, one is actually an opacity tester. If I were to rotate the room around and look through the other side, it would be an opacity tester. Because obviously they want to check minimum coverage guidelines. You basically wait for someone to get that item and they look at it and then they say, okay, it's good. They pass peer review. If there's a problem, they click a series of one. There's a whole bunch of check boxes. They click one that basically says the reason why. Like it has profanity, it has blood, it does something, it violates this. Now, as a creator, you're invited and they're encouraged to go and do peer review, which is a good and bad. The only reason I would tell you to do it is to speed up the queue. So if you put something in the queue and you're impatient, go and start doing peer reviews so it'll hopefully start speeding it up. IMVU does give you 5 promotional credits for every item you review, although I don't find much use for promo credits. I don't think any of you do either. But that's the extra incentive. But the real incentive should be just to speed up the queue. Now, I mentioned this before, but also be careful. Because especially now when peer reviews seem to got really, really long, you have to bear in mind that anything you do with this product outside of just using it in the game or app, whatever you want to call it, if you were to do something like edit, resubmit it, do something with it, put HTML in, it'll throw it back in peer review. So this is a big reason why when I'm on that screen with the red bar, I wait and I put my HTML in before I submit. Just because I've noticed, like, I'll submit, I'll wait, it passes, then I add the HTML later, and then it's back in peer review again. I notice if I go and click the edit settings link just to, let's say, change a category, it goes back in peer review. And especially, of course, you go and change any textures, which I tend to do that sometimes. Like I created the suits and then I saw some problems and things I didn't like. So I went and corrected them, which didn't necessarily change the suit, it just improved on it. But every time I do that, it goes in peer review. And, you know, the two problems with that is once it goes back in peer review, you're now not selling it because it's not in the shop. But the bigger problem also is that if somebody actually bought it, it now becomes treated as an AP item in the room. And I learned that the hard way when I made Chastity that custom baby, and it was in peer review, but she had it because I had to make a change to it. And she was trying to take pictures, and it kept dinging her saying, "You have an AP item," and she didn't know where it came from until we figured that out. Same thing happened when I was in a room with a shirt that I just submitted and I wanted to wear it, and everyone saw it, but they couldn't take photos for some reason. Now, when your item passes peer review, you're going to see this nice little green bar show up at the top. Now, this only shows up for you. Your customers will never see that. Now, at this point, if you've done it already or you're thinking about doing it, I would suggest adding an HTML description. You'll find a link at the bottom. I don't show it here. Next to the, edit settings, edit product, you'll see add HTML description. And you'll see this page as I put back here. It'll have a big blank space to put whatever code you want in there that shows up in this space on the screen. And it lets you also give a chance if you want to change your product rating, change your profit, change your thumbnail. It's a nice little handy page too if you got to change something small and don't want to open the whole thing up in IMVU. You might ask why? Why should I do that? And the answer really is not just the idea of pushing branding or making your product more easier accessible, but also the searches pick this up. I've noticed that when I put in the full title that I want to put in, when I have to put some abbreviated one in, then that full title gets part of the search, which means then it gets pulled in when people are looking for certain things. I notice any of the content and even these recommended items that I only have on mine. Like if I'm searching for the Just Do Nothing shirt, I'll suddenly see the male avatar show up because this is sitting in there. So while IMVU's search engine is not very sophisticated in deciphering different things, it helps. And that search also is being used inside the apps, which means I see these items showing up in the shop on Classic, on mobile, and on beta. So it is worth it to put HTML in here if you can. So if you want to do it, here's a couple of pieces of advice. Go simple. Don't write some insane code if you know how to write code that you would use, let's say, to build a mobile app or some over-the-top website. The IMVU website seems to be a bit dated, and obviously I think the HTML they accept also is a bit dated. I tend to do what's called inline styles, which means, let's say, like a header, instead of just writing a separate file that says, okay, tell the header to be this font size and this color, I'm literally putting it at the header level. So I'll have like H1 and then I'll have style and then put all my styles in there. I wouldn't use any crazy outside scripts or enhancements that would get blocked by IMVU. I've seen some try to bring like carousels and massive interactivity and things in. And, it just doesn't seem to work right because IMVU puts restrictions. However, I have noticed, and I use it, that Google Fonts does work. So I can put that little embed code or import code that they have, and then I can use Google Fonts. If you're going to use product photos, an easy place to store them would be right on IMVU itself. You just go to your photos section, the place where all the snaps and everything else you're putting in there show up. Set up a folder and put all your product photos in there. You just hot link straight to the JPEG. Don't link to the web page, but the actual JPEG. So you're going to click, click, click until all you see is the big image, and that's it. Now, I know many of you don't code, and that's perfectly fine. It's an acquired skill. So I made your life easier. Just go to imvutools.com. Let me show you. This is IMVUtools.com. Originally, it's just a spot where I was storing my own product photos and I was building my own system to build my HTML because I didn't want to code those things all the time either. I've now since turned it into a simple website just to be able to store this seminar, as you can go here and get the sample files, and I will have the video embedded in there. But the more handy thing I want to show you is the product page maker, which basically looks like this. Instead of you having to sit there and write tons of code, you simply fill in all these blanks, or as many of them as you want. Like in the footer, it's optional. Hit generate code, and it will generate the code for you. I've set up an example already using my own stuff. So I put in, my logo, a name. Definitely put the name in because I use that as an alt tag for the image if you have an image. Link to the store, so when people click on your logo, they'll go to your entire store, the full name you want of your product, any description, and you can use some HTML in here. You can use inline HTML. It's a basic blank. I don't parse it. You put an image to your product, and you can have the footer, which basically gives you up to 4 categories in your store. I did try to build something where you could put in your own products themselves like I do, but I couldn't get something to work that was easy. It would end up you having to go dig up the image, find its web address, stick it in there, and it's just too much. I wanted to build what was called a web scraper that would go do it, but I just couldn't make it happen. So you generate the code and you get a nice preview. The look and feel is very simple. I kind of followed the color scheme of IMVU itself, so it kind of matches in there. And same with the fonts and all that, but it works. If you're happy with it, you can go to the minified code and just copy and paste it in there. If you want to do more editing, let's say you have some code skill, I did make everything nested, more laid out. But for most purposes, I'd say use minified if you're just copying and pasting because it's optimized to keep the web page small. And other things that can happen, like for instance, let's say you don't have a logo. Let's get rid of the image. You'll see it then shows up as just text, which is helpful. You can just give your store name and you'll be done with it. Same thing, if you're new and you don't have anything to put in here, we'll just get rid of all of them. It'll put 1, 2, 3, or 4, or keep it simple. But it's a simple thing. It'll save you a lot of time, and it brings you results. Even this alone would help in your searches for people to find your products. So definitely don't overlook that. Okay, you have any questions on submitting your creation into the shop? Oh, I see one. Yeah. The question is, does adding HTML put it back in peer review? And I mentioned that before, and yes, it does. This is why I've gotten into the habit now where I will generate my HTML and everything else when I am basically at the point where I have that red bar. So literally, once I submit my item and now it's in the shop, at least on standby before peer review, you do have access to it. So at that point, I'll go and take some kind of photo, fix it up, throw it in my spot where I store photos, quickly fix up the HTML. Use that page I made and stick it in there. And then I hit the button on the link on the red bar, and, it goes into peer review. The beauty of that is then everything is all set. So then you don't have to go back and do it again. I've seen differences where you put the HTML in after the fact and it stays in the shop and it stays visible, and they just wait for the peer review. I've seen other occasions where it doesn't. I tend to notice, like, if I change the texture or change anything with full-on edit, it goes completely in peer review where it vanishes from the shop. If I edit the settings, it doesn't necessarily vanish, but it isn't necessarily buyable. And then finally, if I add HTML, I've seen it stay buyable, but it's still in peer review, so it gets sketchy sometimes. Sometimes it shows up in Classic but doesn't show up in mobile. So I always say be very careful when you are going to keep going back and editing or adding an HTML or doing things that keep putting your item back in peer review. Now, if you're doing your own item custom for yourself or something, that doesn't matter. But if you're selling things, try to be cognizant of that so that you put everything in one hit, and therefore you only go through peer review once, hopefully. Any other questions? All right, I got one more thing I'm going to show you here. It's not really a tutorial, but it's more about taking a look at things to come. I mentioned this all the way back in the beginning of this seminar, talking about the studio and why you might want to consider at least dabbling with it or start to play with it. And it's because of new things they're putting in there that will never be put in classic. I mean, one day we're going to all be on this new stuff. Hopefully they got everything fixed by then and we don't lose anything in the process. But some of the new features I think are actually turning me on to the point that I want to try building more in the studio and make it happen. One of the things is basically called shininess maps. And what really it is, it's light reflection. It's basically the means of you to add, the reflection of light onto your clothing items. So instead of you just having a certain gradient that always stays there no matter what angle, your item will now change change its lighting as you're in the room. And I'll show you an example of that real quick. Take a look at this. This was the CandiBar jacket, and I just added a simple shininess map. Now, if you take a really close look at it, look at the sleeves, you see how that light is hitting it and it's shining and reflecting off of it. Originally, I just threw imagine taking the 512 by 512 white utility graphic that I gave you and just throw it in there, and it'll be all over the whole jacket. I tried to get a little more sophisticated and started playing with the folds graphic. I inverted it and tried to see if I could just make the folds and certain areas glow. And I mean, I'm still toying with this, but it's amazing that we can pull that off and get this kind of 3D interactivity happening. Now, as you can also notice, I didn't put it on the t-shirt inside because I feel that's a little weird. Like, you don't want to have a shiny t-shirt unless that's your goal. But you can see how these shininess maps can help. Now, another cool feature also already in the studio is called normal maps. A normal map basically is like another texture you're adding on that gives a three-dimensional shadowing to your product. And I'm still playing with this to try to figure this out. Again, I was taking the folds layer and trying to screw with this. But as you can see in the image here, it suddenly added this deeper texture to the whole leather jacket. Makes it look like that rough leather look. So it's quite helpful. Now, how would you make one? Obviously, they're usually created in 3D programs. So hopefully down the road, new derivables that come out will come with normal maps for us to use. But for those of you who want to try to make it yourself, I've included this web address here. This guy made this amazing little generator. Let's take a look at it. So this is basically normal map online. And the way it works is you can see here the original image you put in looks almost like a mask. So I imagine I took like that same folds layer I had, made inverted it so it's kind of like the folds are all white and the rest of the jacket is more black. And it generates then this very purple fluorescent image. That's an actual normal map. And with that, you can start playing with it, like increasing its strength or make it not so strong. Play with the levels if you need to make it more intense. Blur it, sharpen it. Depends on what you want to do. But you can see over here the final results. You see how the light reflects on the grooves, like it doesn't just sort of stay in one hit. And it almost looks like a very three-dimensional item. That's what normal maps are providing. So really what IMVU is trying to build us is the means to be able to add more three-dimensional detail to our products. So it's honestly incredibly exciting. I'm still trying to get the hang of this, but I know I'm planning on going back, and anything leather I'm going to try to add normal and shininess maps to. And even I want to try to build some like leather hot pants for CandiBar that I'm going to, again, try to make shiny. If you look at even their the IMVU Instagram, they've got a bunch of like recent videos and postings showing people making items with normal maps and shininess maps. Now, one more thing that's coming, but it's not in there yet, is the ability to cast shadows. The very first time I heard about some of this new software, when it went into beta, the very first thing they showed me was this sort of an animated GIF, which I've converted into a movie, and I'll play it for you in a minute. This, again, like the normal and shiniest maps, is only going to be available in IMVU Studio and Beta, but they haven't brought it in yet, and it is coming in. We're eventually going to be able to designate, in a sense, what kind of shadow our item casts. So you can do all sorts of fun stuff with that. Let's have a look at the example. Now, this was from a short animated GIF. Watch her shadow when I hit the play button. I'll play it a few times in a row. So as you saw there, it wasn't just the fact that she was casting a shadow, but even the fact it moved with her. When her wings flapped, you saw the shadow move. So imagine you're doing poses and other things and the shadow moves. So what IMVU is trying to really do is build the idea of pinpoint lighting in a room, so you could literally have a spotlight, you could have, let's say, the sunlight cast down on you, have it coming from a different direction, and it will cast a shadow. So because our created items will have these shadow maps added on later, then we could basically start designating how the shadow gets casted. Or we could even start screwing around and not have a shadow get casted at all. Let's say for all the vampires out there. So we're at the tail end of this thing. I appreciate all your patience and being on this with me for this long discussion. Before we end, I just want to leave with a couple of last tips. Start small and grow from there. This limit shirt that I'm wearing, that was my first item. Basically, I started with a simple t-shirt and then I grew. I started then deciding to make football merchandise for girls. I made jeans. I then started making more tops. I then got into making suits and other items and even accessories, anything that hits my brain. But it might seem overwhelming, but I would always tell you start simple. Go small. Find something small that you could easily do because you see the textures, it's not too much, and go from there. But challenge yourself. Every time I try to do these things, I'm always trying to challenge myself to see if I can get better with this. Can I put fishnets on something? Can I make that look more realistic? Even to this day, while I use these textures that are predetermined, I'm always still trying to see, could I draw my own folds using Photoshop the way I see all these tutorial videos? Still working on that part. Build quality over quantity. I see some creators out there, they just put out like 50 items in a day, which is really one item where they make 50 different color variations. And that's fine, but then I look at the items and I feel like they were just hastily thrown together. And yeah, somebody could stand there and think, well, those 50 items will sell faster than you crafting these wonderful items, but I still feel that a quality item will sell better than some hastily thrown together item. Take some time, take your time, try to come up with something better. To think about those little details that you might decide. You might decide, hey, I want these buttons to be a different color or slightly different color. Or I want a gradient on something to make it look more, shadowed with the light. That little bits of quality go a long way and it helps your product stand out. Also, you can always go back and edit. And I put the suits on these two to show that because ever since I put these suits out, I had gone up about 3 times and made corrections because I would see something that didn't look right, something I didn't like, some little quirk, and I went in and fixed it. Even if somebody bought it, I felt like I owed it to that customer to give them a quality product. And it's better to go do that and even inconvenience somebody for a day than to have a shoddy product in the store. Strive to keep your file sizes small. I pointed out Kraken is a good tool if you need to optimize your images down to the last bits. But also even that trick with like using the 4x4 pixel black image to mask items out that you're not using because it keeps your file size small. Then it's not your stuff that's causing someone's KBs to be too high. Lastly, be proud of your work. Some people get too hard on themselves. They're trying to do things. They're not getting it right. They're beating themselves up, or they put things in the shop and they'll say things like, yeah, I know my stuff isn't as good as yours, but I stand there and tell them, be proud of what you did. You made this. You made this happen. Challenge yourself to do better, but you did this. And believe me, my first shirts and other items didn't look as good as things they do now. I had to keep challenging myself, but I was always proud of everything I did. The only rule you have when it comes to making your stuff is it has to look good to you. Doesn't matter if I like it, if some other creator thinks it's awesome. It has to look good to you. And if you're trying to sell it, that the customers like it to the extent that they would buy it. And believe me, the customers are not as nitpicky as you will be. So I think you'll be fine. Okay, before we end, are there any last questions about anything discussed today? Okay, we got a question asking, are those shininess maps and normal maps ever going to be offered on the classic clients? It would be nice, but I don't think they're going to do it. I gotta say right now, I don't work for IMVU. The only thing I've been doing lately is being a beta tester, trying out their new software and throwing them feedback, mainly trying to drive them to make sure they don't leave out key features we want on the new stuff. But the hard reality is that, at least when I saw a year ago in a Twitch presentation, the IMVU developers basically said they wanted to bring new features, but they just couldn't do it with the old code of that old client. Because let's be honest, any long-time people from IMVU know that classic client has been around for a long time. So it was time for a rewrite. And obviously, they probably wanted to brand it to match their current Next look. Love it or hate it, that's how it's going to be. But part of it is they felt they needed to get a better 3D engine in there, and they just couldn't do it with the old clients. So that's why they're creating this new stuff. At this point, I think they're just going to keep the classic one running to make sure that people can use it until they're happy enough with the beta. But eventually, I think one day they're just going to flip the switch and say, that's it, everybody's got to use the new thing. Whether many of us stay or people jump ship to other apps or whatever, that remains to be seen. I, for one, am going to give it a shot. That's why I've been using the new stuff and playing with it, because I feel like as long as it's got all the features we want, it's not the end of the world. A new look and feel is not that bad. Hopefully, though, they do improve the 3D. I want to believe there's a better engine coming in, because I still feel the classic client has better 3D than the new stuff. But let's see what happens. Here's another question. Yeah, I mean, everyone I'm talking to right now knows me on Discord and within IMVU. You can always reach out to me if you have questions or need help. I can always get on a call through Discord or something. We can chat. For the rest of you out there that could be watching this on YouTube, just leave questions in the comments. I'll try to check in on it regularly and answer questions as they come. But as I pointed out before, you go to imvutools.com, as I just pointed out earlier, and there's all the sample files there for all the 4 apps. And if you're not using one of those 4, try downloading the Photoshop files and feeding them into your app of choice. It might open them, as I noticed with all these others. But yeah, I'm here to help. We'll figure this out. I'm not going to do it for you, but, I'll help any way I can. Any last questions? All right. I want to thank you all for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking part in this. Thankfully, it went smooth. And hopefully, maybe down the road, we can have another one. Maybe go advanced and talk about some other features and items as well as if I learn them, and we keep building on that. For now, go out, create, take chances, challenge yourself, and do the best you can. Thank you much.